From the heartland of America, the gateway to the West. Good morning, good evening, wherever you may be across the nation, around the world. I'm George Norrie, and welcome to the world's most listened to Coast to Coast AM. Good to be with you, and thanks for the privilege of broadcasting this wonderful program for you. Open lines at the half, and next hour, Paul Kimball, UFO cases in North America. And get ready for some of the things he's going to say. Well, here's some quick stories of the day. Even though this tape, purporting to be from Osama bin Laden, has not been authenticated yet, he is saying that Zacarias Moussaoui had no link to the 9/11/2001 attacks. Now, this, according to the al-Qaeda leader, again, but like I said, this audio tape that surfaced on a website has not been authenticated. Who knows who it may be? It could be bin Laden. Bin Laden's alleged voice claims responsibilities to carry out the attacks, that they were given by him to 19 men, and that Moussaoui was not one of them. The new tape is propaganda, plain and simple, says a U.S. intelligence source. The official said the message is part of bin Laden's continuing effort to demonstrate that he's a relevant extremist leader who is knowledgeable of current events. The tape is not entirely unexpected. Leading up to the Moussaoui verdict, the government was monitoring jihadist websites in anticipation of a response to the jury's decision. A new Zogby poll apparently reveals that less than half of the American public trusts the official 9/11 story or believes the attacks were adequately investigated. The poll is the first scientific survey of Americans' belief in a 9/11 cover-up or the need to investigate possible U.S. government complicity. In a moment, we're going to be talking with some people about this from the 9/11 Truth Organization. That's a coalition of researchers, journalists, and victim family members working to expose and get answers to this situation. So that story is upcoming in just a moment. Now, don't panic on this one, because we are still going to hold our own here in our views that the bird flu will not become a pandemic. But according to the World Health Organization, they say a family of 8 people infected with the bird flu in Indonesia may have passed the disease among themselves rather than catching it from poultry. The agency did not immediately indicate whether it was going to raise its alert level, which remained at 3, where it's been for months. That means there is no very limited human-to-human transmission. They don't seem to be too concerned about that, but I wanted you to know about that story anyway. Another attack by an animal on a human. This in Orwell, Ohio. A 500-pound bear escaped from an animal breeder, entered a neighboring home, and attacked a woman. The victim was expected to survive. The bear was lured out of the house and shot to death by the breeder. But still, again, another attack by animals. The Egyptian authorities have given the go-ahead for the underwater exploration of what appears to be a Roman city submerged in the Mediterranean. Well, the old guy that we talk about all the time, Zahi Hawass, said in a statement that an excavation team that had found the ruins of the Roman city some 20 miles east of the Suez Canal on Egypt's north coast. The archaeologists had found buildings, bathrooms, ruins of a Roman fortress, ancient coins, bronze vases, and pieces of pottery that all date back to the Roman era. Egypt's Roman era, by the way, lasted from 30 B.C. to 337 A.D. In Bucharest, Romania, more than 60 years after it was seized by communists, the Romanian government is to hand back one of the country's most popular tourist sites, the fabled Dracula Castle, to its former owner. The handover ceremony will take place Friday in the 14th Century Castles Museum, deep within the fortress in Transylvania. The castle, worth an estimated $25 million, was once owned by the late Queen Marie and bequeathed to her daughter, Princess Elena, in 1938. It was confiscated by the communists in 1948 and fell into disrepair. Now, in a moment, as I mentioned, we are going to be talking with a member of the 9/11 Truth Organization about this quest here. Apparently, Americans would like to get more information. They want to get to the bottom of 9/11. We'll be back in a moment on that story on Coast to Coast AM. Mike Berger is the media coordinator for the 9/11 Truth Organization. Born and raised in New York, he earned a degree in sociology with a focus on human motivation. The 9/11 Truth Organization, as I mentioned, is a coalition of researchers, journalists, and family members working to expose and get answers to the hundreds of still unresolved questions concerning 9/11. Mike works to get to the truth of what went wrong and why we were so unprepared for the attacks. He's currently married, lives in St. Louis, my neck of the woods. Mike, I'm still in St. Louis. We should have invited you down to the cave for this interview. How are you?
Great. How are you, George?
Good. It's good to talk with you. This Zogby poll, which is estimating now that over 70 million American adults support a new 9/11 investigation, tells me that there's still a lot of unrest. After all these years, they cannot muster, those people who believe the true government position cannot even muster 50% of the people to believe the story. What does this tell you, Mike, in the organization 9/11 Truth?
Well, I think it's quite amazing, actually, if you think about the powerful machinery of the mainstream media, or as some people call them, the liberal media, in promoting the official propaganda of the government conspiracy story. If they can't muster, after 4.5 years, more than half the country supporting the official story, it would seem to me that it demonstrates that grassroots movements in this country are and can be effective. That we no longer rely on just the mainstream media for information, of the power of the Internet and new technology to communicate and get research and evaluate evidence out to people. It works. It's working. And that I think it's a really a positive, optimistic sign for our future that we can reclaim the country effectively.
Do you believe there's going to be any activity, because your organization, 9/11 Truth, would like to get these politicians or candidates to really recognize, hey, this is a major issue here. Let's get some answers. But is it going to go any further than where it is now, Mike?
Absolutely. I think this poll shows that the American people, I mean, again, those who are aware of, for example, the collapse of this third building, Building 7, happens to be almost the same proportion of people in the poll who don't trust the official story and want a new independent investigation. So I think the implications are that if you're a political candidate running in 2006, there's an enormous constituency here of people who are looking for change.
Mike, so important for you to tell us about your organization, because you are not conspiracy buffs. You are a coalition of some dedicated people. Tell me about the members of the 9/11 Truth organization.
Sure. I mean, we're a grassroots organization made up of average people, of, in some cases, researchers, journalists, artists, scholars, average people who put together and publish research on the Internet, put together events like our upcoming conference in Chicago, 9/11, Revealing the Truth, Reclaiming Our Future, and are involved in public education to raise awareness about the events of 9/11, but not only 9/11, because ultimately for us to be effective as in changing the direction our country is going, we have to find common ground with other people who also see that 9/11 has been the justification for so many unfavorable policies, illegal wars. Even just last week when they released the Flight 77 video at the Pentagon,
right.
Over and over you heard this as the justification that Americans needed to be reminded why we're in Iraq, why we're in this war, and why it's okay to have Americans under surveillance.
Mike, is your organization taking a stand on that issue itself, Flight 77, that some people say never hit the Pentagon? My question to those people, whether it did or did not, I do not know. Though I'd like to see the video, quite frankly, because what I've seen so far doesn't show me a plane hitting the Pentagon at all, so I have some doubts. But I want to know what happened to the plane, where it might be. Does your organization look into that?
Actually, George, our position is very similar to yours in that we support the Freedom of Information Act requests not just by Judicial Watch, but there was actually another person, a Mr. Bingham, who had filed multiple Freedom of Information Act requests. His were never acknowledged. It's interesting that the government chose to honor the Freedom of Information Act request of Judicial Watch, and yet they really didn't, because they only gave us those more ambiguous frames, as you said, which still don't prove their case. So for us, I mean, on another level, I see the Flight 77 issue as a distraction, because there are so many more salient and hard evidence of potential complicity, such as, the collapse of Building 7 in New York, a third building not hit by a plane, collapsed at 5:20, and the media shows the towers coming down, the planes hitting the towers. But why won't they ever show this third building? I mean, which in any other state, such as, Missouri, it'd be the tallest building in the state. 47-story building came down in 6.6 seconds in its own footprint, which is what's so odd about it. If you begin to look at how this building was built, it didn't have a support structure like in normal high-rise buildings that was symmetrical, because it stood over an electrical substation in Lower Manhattan. So for it to come straight down is quite odd. And then even eyewitnesses, such as New York Magazine reporter Mark Jacobson said, I was down at Ground Zero. I was there. I saw the building come down, and a firefighter, came up to me and he said, that building's going to come down. Well, that's kind of strange, because no steel frame structure has ever collapsed from fire alone. And
I've been wrestling with something, Mike, for a number of years now, and I'm almost at a point now where I'm pretty secure in what I think might have happened. And I'm going to say this for really the first time. I hinted about it when I had a roundtable discussion on 9/11 several months ago. I have been wrestling with the question of why is this so polarized? Why will we have slightly more than 50% of the people not believing the government's version, and then the rest of the people believing everything that they've been told, to a point where there's no middle ground here? I am beginning to believe that both people are correct. And what I think might have happened here is there's no doubt in my mind that the Osama bin Ladens and his group of cronies were part of this, and that he was smart enough to convince 19 people to commit suicide on these missions. However, and this is where I think the conspiracy people are accurate as well, I think there was another group involved that somehow got bin Laden involved, financed him, helped him in order to justify whatever's going on, whatever they're profiting on, and they got together as a conspiratorial group together and did what they did. So I think the two factions are correct. They just haven't put it together yet. I think that's what happened. What's your take?
I mean, it's quite possible, but once you start to dig into the details, it really becomes quite murky because, for example, we now know that the hijackers were under continuous surveillance, and I don't use that word loosely. I mean continuous surveillance by both domestic and foreign intelligence agencies. You had Able Danger. You had FBI agents who, sent their reports to headquarters, and those investigations were thwarted by the same few people who we know were then subsequently, within 1 year after 9/11, promoted. We had one cell living with an FBI informant. They had driver's licenses, telephones in their names. Some of them were even registered to vote. They trained at military air bases. So when you begin to look at that, it becomes quite puzzling how it is that we were unaware on the one hand, especially in light of whistleblower testimony like Robert Wright and Colleen Rowley, et cetera, saying, we knew this was coming. We tried to really prevent this, and we were prevented from doing our job.
Well, which backs up my argument, Mike, that there were members within government who knew what were going on. There were members in government who wanted this to happen for their own personal reasons, and they go ahead and cut the deal with the bin Laden group to get this done with al-Qaeda. I mean, there's no doubt in my mind that somebody flew those planes into those two towers. Somebody was trying to hijack and successfully hijacked And whether the Flight 93 over Pennsylvania was shot down or pulled down, who knows? I happen to think it was shot down. But the point is that somebody had to do that. And somebody had to be convinced to go on a suicidal mission. Whether just the pilot knew about it and his friends did not, who knows? But to me, your argument points out that mine might be correct in that there were two groups working together to get this thing done.
Well, we can take that a little further. I mean, on the one hand, we know that Osama was an asset of the CIA. We backed him, financed him, armed him. And to take what you're saying a little further, there's another possibility that is a little bit easier to understand, which is maybe the people who were trained or co-opted for this event, for this attack, for these hijackings, they didn't even have to know they were suicide hijackings. I mean, in essence, they may have been under the impression that they were going to make political demands. I mean, there may be other alternatives here. It gets a bit murky. It really depends on where the research leads.
However, if we as a group can take the position that a group got together with bin Laden and put this together, maybe bin Laden was approached by it, but they put this together, I think we can get the answers quicker.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think the entire issue surrounding this is that, again, going back to the poll, it demonstrates that the people who are aware of the evidence want really an independent investigation, either by Congress or an international body. But I think really it has to be a truly independent investigation. It can't be run by the same people in Congress. And I think that also touches back where you were going on how split the country is. Because if many people only see this as a polarized left-right dichotomy or Republican-Democrat, that it's always filtered through that lens, then effectively the game stays the same. It's kind of like a good cop, bad cop game. And yet what we're hoping is that, in light of these poll numbers, that candidates who are running for office in the 06 election cycle, that the American people will see that you also have an alternative, that there are people who reflect your values, who are running for office, who may not be from either one of those parties. Maybe they are, but it's what's in their platform that's important. What do they stand for? And if they reflect our values, it's incumbent on us to rise up and support them, because really it's the only way we're going to take back the country. If you don't like the way things are going, if you don't want to be surveyed, if you don't want to have your constitutional rights eroded. So I think we have a choice here.
Mike, this conference that's coming up first week of June, if you want to tell us a little bit about that, please.
Sure. The title of the conference is 9/11 Revealing the Truth, Reclaiming Our Future, and it's being held in the Chicago Embassy Suites O'Hare, which is in Rosemont, Illinois, June 2nd through 4th, Friday through Sunday. And we're asking people to come and join us to help create this plan of action or strategy for taking the country back. We have 6 keynote speakers. We have over 40 to 50 hours of presentations in an education and a strategy track. And we plan on coming out of this conference with a strategy that will be developed by the people who come and join us. We're asking them to come to Chicago, join us at the conference, and help us take the country back with your input. You can help draft this plan and put it into action, because I think it's time for us to find common ground and to stop being played for fools who are continuously pointed against each other, where we can find our power is finding common ground, coming together, and saying, we're not going to put up with this anymore. We're going to hold our elected officials accountable. We want to open an independent investigation, and we want justice for the American people and for the family members.
All right, Mike, thank you so much. Appreciate you being on the program. Get some sleep. I know you've been up taking interviews all day long.
Thank you very much, George. Right. I really appreciate it.
All right, that's Mike Berger. He's with an organization called 911truth.org, and I really believe that both the conspiracy people and those people who simply believe the version that we've all been told. I think there's a meshing there. I think the real truth is somewhere in the middle. I really do. Open lines, just you, just me. West of the Rockies, 800-618-8255. East of the Rockies, 800-825-5033. First-time caller line is 818-501-4721 of the wild card line. Ready to roll at 818-501-4109. Well, are you interested in chemtrails, string theory, parallel universes? What about multiple dimensions? Well, you can read all about it in the June issue of the After Dark newsletter. It's the monthly magazine made especially for you. And if you don't believe everything you hear at night, well, every month the After Dark newsletter arrives right there in your mailbox in living color to let you know that you're not dreaming. And also, we'd like to throw in a complimentary double CD, the After Dark CD, bumper music, ghost stories, and some incredible phone calls to the program as our way of saying thanks for subscribing to After Dark. Limited number of those, so here's the phone number, 1-800-727-5505. That's 1-888-727-5505. Or you can subscribe online by going to the coasttocoastam.com website. And welcome back to Coast to Coast. I'm George Norrie. Open lines for you this hour. The next hour, Canadian researcher and filmmaker Paul Kimball joins us as we're going to talk about some real strange UFO reports that haven't really gotten the kind of attention they should. I'm going to talk with Paul as well about some older UFO cases as well. He's doing a film on UFOs, and he will shed some interesting light on the subject. Paul was a very brief guest of ours when Linda Moulton Howe was at a conference in Las Vegas a couple years ago, and we've brought him back for a full show. Let's go to the phones. Wildcard line. Welcome to Coast to Coast. You're on the air with us. Hi there.
Oh, hello, George. This is Lance from Nebraska, and this is a random thought about John Teeter. Could with President Bush sending National Guard to the border, could this be like could this start the Civil War that John Teeter was talking about?
Well, you know, I thought of that, and a lot of people have thought of that. John Teeter, of course, being the alleged time traveler.
Oh, yes.
And who knows? Now, one of the things that Teeter did say was that the United States would experience another civil war.
Right.
And, you know, if tensions continue with this illegal immigration situation, you just never know.
Oh, I don't know about you, but it sure keeps me up at night. It's just, you know, it's wild.
Oh,
you know?
Don't stay up too late at night unless you're listening to the show.
Oh, I work second shift, so, you know, I customary stay up late, so...
Okay, I appreciate you being part of the program. Next up, east of the Rockies, you're on Coast to Coast. Hi there.
Hey, George.
Yeah, hi.
This is Dallas from Oklahoma. How you doing?
Good, Dallas. Thank you.
George, I was calling in to, you mentioned earlier that the bird flu may have mutated.
Well, that's what the World Health Organization is looking into with a family in Indonesia. I am still going to take the position, as the several strong guests have on this program, that the bird flu will not turn into a pandemic.
Okay. What I wanted to point out, George, is that, well, the world is starting to look eerily similar to Stephen King's novel The Stand. I mean, you remember how at the beginning of that they were saying the arrival of the Dark Man, and this guy was ringing a bell and stuff and saying the Dark Man was coming before the disease hit.
Yeah.
Well, that's happening now because of the 666 date that's coming up. There's some groups that are saying that the Antichrist and the Iranian president is calling the Mahdi, said the Mahdi may show or something like that. And it's just getting eerily similar to that novel, so I hope that Stephen King didn't write it as prophetic. You know?
Let's hope not. You know, these are really strange times for all of us. I mean, I'm glad I'm alive at this era. You know, I saw the moon landing. I was 13 years old when John F. Kennedy was assassinated. In my lifetime, and I don't know about you, Dallas, but I have gone through some incredible things as an eyewitness to history, and I think I've only seen just a little bit of some of the things that are going to happen on this planet.
Right. I've only been here 30 years, but I've seen a lot too, you know.
I think our biggest concern, that a lot of people just aren't talking about is if we ever get hit by an asteroid. I think that has got more reality to it than anything we've talked about.
Right. Sure does.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks.
Appreciate you being on the program. Next up, let's go to our West of the Rockies line. You're on Coast to Coast. Hi there.
Hello.
Hello.
This is Karen from Sacramento.
Listening at KSTE.
Yes, from the low valley, not the high desert.
The low valley. Let's hope the low valley never gets flooded, huh?
Well, if the levees break, they will.
Oh, no, don't even say that.
No, we don't want that.
Go knock on wood sometime.
Yeah, my head. Anyway, I was wondering what you thought about the two announcements that I heard today. And the first one was that Iran launched a missile.
Some cruise missiles.
Yes.
They're doing more testing.
Yeah, that the United States said that the president was trying to get Europe to put up some anti-ballistic missiles headed or aimed at Iran to keep Iran in tow. Both of these things were announced in the same day. Are they trying to say that something is going to happen pretty soon?
I think there's a very strong possibility that things could get out of control. First of all, we don't need anti-ballistic missiles to point at Iran. We've got them pointed there already.
Oh.
Our submarines, which have really been the true deterrent of nuclear war, have the capability of hitting Moscow, Beijing, Tehran within minutes.
Oh.
And we have submarines off the coasts and in the oceans.
Then why would he try to spend money to build more missiles? I don't understand.
You know what? It's a game that our leaders are playing with other leaders. I mean, I'm not going to doubt that the Iranian situation isn't a potentially dangerous one. Frankly, that's the one we should have looked at first before Iraq. But now we're in this mess, and we've got to figure out what to do with it. I really think Israel's going to do something before anybody does anything.
Well, there's a couple other things. Another thing today, they said that the president was said that if Israel got in trouble, that we would back him up. We have
to. We have no choice there.
Well, I know, but he announced it officially, which is kind of unusual. And then the other thing was those cruise missiles that they sent off in Iran, the one that they were practicing with, can hit the United States. I couldn't believe that. We're too far away, aren't we?
Well, you know what they say it could hit. I don't think it can. I think we are too far away for the Iranian missiles.
Something's going on, huh?
Yeah, it is. It's positioning, first of all. It's strategy. But more importantly, we live in some very tense times right now. And I hope people understand that. I know it. But you know what? We're not alone. We're always in it together.
Okay. Thanks, George.
Okay.
Have a good night.
You too. Sometimes all of us in our own lives get very concerned about events that are happening. I've heard little children cry because they're afraid of things that they hear on the news. And, it's difficult to comfort them. But everybody needs to understand that, we're not little islands to ourselves, as much as some of us would like to be. We're all in this thing together. I mean, and whatever happens. You deal with it. You move on because, that's part of living. And it's happened on this planet since the beginning of humankind. And they always have had catastrophes, and many of them man-made and man-created. We're going to create more. But you know what? I will take this positive attitude with me for as long as I can, no matter what we will face. And we'll face some pretty rough times together. Wildcard line, you're up. Thanks for holding. Hi there.
Hi.
Yeah, where are you?
Oh, hey, George.
I surprised you, didn't I?
Yes, you certainly did. Your voice sounds so different tonight. I've spoken with you a few times before, and it's great to speak with you again. And, George, thank you for covering the most important issues of our times and what you'll do in the future for that, I'm sure. I really do appreciate it. We all do.
Well,
and, George, I wanted to mention to you that when you had Eric Huffschmidt on about 4 months ago, I think it was.
Yes.
That I saw his video that he put out called Troubling Questions within a year before his appearance on your program. And in this video, which is you're well aware, centers around the Pentagon strike on 9/11, that he shows a picture, a photograph on a runway sits a Global Hawk flying missile. And it has very distinctive heat-resistant, aerodynamically designed wheels that the tires are mounted onto. And I noticed this. And then in the very next thing that he goes to, and I wish you'd take a look at this, they go inside the Pentagon hole. And inside the Pentagon hole, they're shining a light, and that same wheel, and it's a small wheel, it's nothing off of a large passenger airplane, is sitting right there, leaning at about a 45-degree angle on the right-hand side of the picture, right on the ground.
Oh, no, you're right about that. And let me mention that Eric Hufschmidt, that interview that we had. Eric is a great writer, and his video is also fantastic. He had a difficult time conveying his thoughts on the radio, and we roughed him up a little bit that night. And then he, went into a tangent on whether we went to the moon or not, which really got me going. And I brought Richard C. Hoagland in to try to settle the matter. And it seemed like we ganged up on Eric that night. We really didn't intend to. He's a good person, and again, as I said, a great researcher. But he had a difficult time trying to convey his thoughts on the radio. I think Eric would be great in a roundtable discussion on 9/11, for example, with other people who could help back him up with some of his thoughts. A lot of times we have turned down guests on the program who have had great stories, great books, great research, but they can't convey it. And, we really, and our producers, do a great job trying to get the people who can carry on a lengthy conversation. And Eric had a rough time that night, for those of you who are Eric fans. East of the Rockies, you're on Coast to Coast. Hi there.
Hi, George. It's Barry in Springfield, Missouri.
Hi.
I was going to tell you about a friend of mine. His brother-in-law, he lives up in St. Charles near you there.
Oh, yeah.
And he was, back in the winter, but before the first of the year, he was cutting a big tree down. And when he cut this large tree and it fell, he didn't see above him the tree he was standing under had a big deadfall, and it fell on him and crushed him.
Oh.
Hit him in the head. They say it literally drove him straight down into the ground up to his mid-shins.
Oh, my God.
And he had skull fracture, numerous spinal fractures from the C-spine down through his lumbar. And he was in the hospital in a coma for over 6 days before he ever regained any consciousness.
He's lucky he was alive.
Lucky. Yeah, definitely lucky. Initially...
Boy, you got a real bad phone line there. I wonder if you could wrap this up, because it sounds like a great story.
Okay. Well, he was in a coma, and when he came out of it, they said he'll probably never walk again. He'll be severely injured forever. But he's made a remarkable recovery. And last weekend, when my friend went to see him, he said that when he first got hit, he saw a man with the skin on his skull brown and grizzled down like right over a skull, and with long white hair and glowing red eyes. And he reached out to him and told him, "You're dead."
Oh, my God.
And he said, "I knew he was the devil, so I wouldn't go to him." And after he didn't go with the devil, he said he spent the next 6 days with Jesus building an ox cart, and that Jesus told him that he would be okay and that he would recover and to tell his story, but that he could not profit from it.
Well, I tell you what I would love for you to do, if you would. Just email us, me especially, George at coasttocoastam.com, and give me some information. And if he's at a point where he can start to talk again and can stay up late, I wouldn't mind getting him on to talk about that entire episode. Can you imagine a chunk of a tree falling on you, driving you down into the ground, and you're still alive to talk about it? That's incredible. Yeah, do that. Your hum on your phone was really starting to get bad. First-time caller line, you're on Coast to Coast. Welcome to the show. Hi there.
Hi, George. First of all, I want to say you are a man source of information, intelligence. There's not a night I don't think I listen to you. Actually, I shifted to the night shift just to listen to your radio show.
That's devotion.
Yeah, my girlfriend doesn't like that too much. But,
it is difficult. I mean, this is a different kind of shift for all of us.
I have a fantastic dream to tell you, and I mean, this is a dream I had 20 years ago, but to this day, when I tell people, they're amazed. What happened was, I'm from Staten Island, New York, and I was being chased in the car by another car driver who was out for some reason to kill me.
Now, this is in the dream, or did this really happen to you?
No, sometimes in New York that could happen, but no, this
exactly.
is in the dream.
All right.
You never know in New York. Well, anyway, I'm racing all over Staten Island, and finally I get onto a campus, a school campus. It must have been summer because there was nobody there, and I'm racing through the campus, and I lost him through dodging through, buildings, around buildings. I didn't know where he was. I found a dormitory. I jumped out of the car. I went in the dormitory, went up to the seventh floor. It was a seventh-floor building. I went onto the roof to try to locate where he was. Next thing I know, I hear the ceiling, or the roof door open. And who's standing there? Man in a black suit with a gun. Couldn't see his face, though. All I knew is he was standing there with a gun. I looked at him and looked over the edge and says, I have a choice. Either I'm going to get shot and be dead, or I have a choice to jump and land 7 floors down onto grass and bushes and have a chance to live. So I took the choice to jump. You know how I woke up?
How'd you wake up?
I woke up in mid-flight, whether I jumped off the bed or I rolled off the bed, and I landed on the rug, and I screamed out, oh, my God. I was rubbing my hands into the rug. I'm saying, oh, my God. I jumped 7 floors and I'm alive. And I lifted my head, and what am I staring at? My night table.
I love it.
It was an unbelievable dream, a dream I'll never forget. Some dreams you forget within 10 minutes after you're up. This I'll never forget.
I love it. Thanks a lot.
All right. Take care, George. Thank you for all the good shows.
Okay, that is a neat story. Let's go. Time for 1 or 2 more. You're on the air with us, Wildcard caller. Hi there.
Alrighty. Hey, this is Michael, Lincoln, Nebraska. George, awesome job. On behalf of my person and again and again and again, all your listeners, years and years and years. It's been awesome. I've never got to call before, but my question, I think, could be, what's your item of most concern?
Well, I guess twofold. One is deception. I can't stand it when leaders do not tell us the truth for whatever their own personal agenda is. We know what's happened in the past. We know what's going to happen in the future. That bothers me because what I see happening now seems to be an acceleration of this agenda. That concerns me. And I'm also concerned about a world war. I'm concerned about a world war that includes nuclear weapons that would bring in Russia and China. And, I'm concerned about my kids, and I'm concerned about my grandchildren. I want them to have a great life. I want them to have a safe life. But I don't want them to have it under this kind of tension. And that, I think, is our biggest issue. Now, as I've said before, we're in it together. Whatever happens, happens. We'll move ahead. Whether, I'm broadcasting out of a tin can to 15 people because, every power thing has been blown up. Who knows? But that bothers me more than anything. How about you?
Yeah, well, I'm right in step with you. In fact, I've been doing some reading and studying. There's a guest I would suggest in light of what you just said, a man, Yisrael Hawkins. He's actually got a huge study on prophecy over numerous years. He's a heck of a historian. He's got some books out, and he's
all right. Would you promise to send me some information on that? You've got my
George,
email address.
I'm writing down George at Coast to Coast right down in my notebook, and
okay. And make sure you put the AM at the end. CoastToCoastAM.com.
Coast to Coast
AM.com. That's right, George.
Alrighty. I have another little nifty site that I ran across, a gift type thing for your listeners, if you'd permit it or not.
I can't do that, only because they hold it. But give it to Tom, and then we'll take a look at it. And if there's anything worthwhile, hey, you never know. My gosh, this hour's going. I've got to tell you, these hours in this show seems to be going by faster and faster and faster. And speaking of speed, some of us are saying, all right, when is Art going to be back on? Not this weekend, for sure. I'll tell you what the weekend schedule is a little bit later on once we put that together. Because we've been working, some people are saying, George, you post the week stuff on the website, but you don't put the weekend stuff up right away. That's because we don't know either. So we try to hold back as long as we can until we realize what the situation is with Mr. Bell before we go ahead with Plan B, which we're always working on. We've always got a backup here at Coast to Coast AM. But he is not going to be on this weekend. Don't count on that. And then hopefully next week and the weekend in June, our special guest tonight, Paul Kimball. If you have a computer, get up to the coasttocoastam.com website, take a look at the feature article, and see what one of Paul's entries is. This is neat. This is an account of a very strange meteorological occurrence that took place in Venezuela in 1886, in which a family of 9 was made ill by a very vivid, dazzling light. It's a great story. That's just one of the things we'll talk about in a moment on Coast to Coast AM. Well, Paul Kimball, he's the founder of Red Star Films Limited and a member of the Nova Scotia Barristers Society, the Nova Scotia Film Advisory Committee, and the Society of Composers, Authors, and Publishers. Since 2001, Paul has established a reputation of one of Canada's leading UFO researchers, and both through his work as an award-winning documentary filmmaker and as a researcher, writer, speaker. He has appeared on television, radio, in person, at conferences, symposiums to discuss the UFO phenomenon. Currently in post-production for the documentary Fields of Fear about the Canadian animal mutilation phenomena, due for release in the late summer of 2006. It was on Coast to Coast. What was it, sometime around 2004 or so, Paul, with Linda Moulton Howe for a bit?
That's right, George. It was during the second crash retrieval concert that Bob and Ryan Wood put on in Las Vegas, Nevada.
Well, it is great to get you back on. We tried to get Paul Hellyer on for just a little bit tonight with you, but he could not. He's getting up there in age, and I guess he's not feeling too well tonight, as a matter of fact. But what do you think of his story? Former Canadian defense minister basically saying, that we're in a battle with extraterrestrials.
I think I've been a frequent and well-known critic of Paul Hellyer's sort of disclosure story. I think there's a number of problems with it, not the least of which is Mr. Hellyer himself, who is most Canadians who remember Mr. Hellyer, which is an ever-dwindling number, unfortunately. His primary political time was in the mid to late 1960s and into the early to mid-1970s, so even before my generation. Had a bit of a mercurial career, a fellow who bounced around the political spectrum in Canada from center to right to left and all points in between. And most notoriously, I think most Canadians probably best remember him as the guy who unified the Canadian Armed Forces. I come from Halifax, Nova Scotia, which is Canada's major East Coast naval base, has been for hundreds of years. And he's not fondly remembered there. He's the guy who put all the sailors in green uniforms.
I remember that. And
all the airmen in green uniforms, too. So he's an interesting fellow. He was certainly, in his prime, he was one of Canada's bright, rising young political stars in the 50s and 60s, and then his career basically took a nosedive right down through the floor in the late 1960s when he resigned from Pierre Trudeau's cabinet and switched over to the Conservative Party. Now, in terms of his UFO thing, though, the problem for me, and I think with a lot of UFO researchers, is that Mr. Hellyer bases his claim that UFOs are alien vehicles come here to Earth not on anything he knew or heard or saw when he was Minister of Defense up in Canada. If that had been the case, that would be something indeed and something worth looking at. However, he bases it instead on Philip Corso's discredited book, The Day After Roswell, which I think you'd have a hard time finding any serious UFO researcher who takes that book seriously. So the problem with the Minister of Defense, former Minister of Defense Hellyer, is his own somewhat checkered career causes credibility problems up in Canada, at least, which I don't think most Americans are aware of. I think they just hear former Minister of National Defense and they go, oh, well, that's impressive. I think if you ask most Americans right now, well, if Donald Rumsfeld was to come out in 5 years as the former Secretary of Defense, would he be a particularly credible person to listen to, they might have a different answer. So in that sense, I think Americans aren't particularly aware of Mr. Hellier's somewhat credibility problems in Canada. But most importantly, in the UFO field, I think it's because he bases his claims not on what he knew personally, but on what he read in Phil Corso's book.
And you are correct, too. As a matter of fact, I was I've got to get you and Bill Burns together. Bill Burns is a co-author with me on a book that's coming out in September. And as you know, Bill co-wrote the book The Day After Roswell with Corso.
That's right.
I'd love to put you two in a room to talk about this, but you're correct. Bill was telling me about Hellier just this weekend, and he said, George, he based everything on the book, not on his own personal observations as defense minister.
Absolutely, and I was talking to a number of people who were at the Toronto Exopolitics Symposium back in September when Mr. Hellier first came forward and made his claims. And a number of them said to me they were sitting in the audience, interested to hear what Hellier had to say, and as soon as the words Day After Roswell and Philip Corso came out of his mouth, they started slinking down into their chairs because they knew that if what they were expecting what they were hoping, I suppose, that he would say, yes, I saw documents when I was Minister of Defense.
Yes.
Didn't come out. In fact, Mr. Hellier went to great pains to say he didn't really see anything when he was the Minister of Defense. In fact, yes, there was some investigation of some UFO claims, but he didn't find it terribly interesting, which you can believe or not believe, but if there was a serious investigation going on into UFOs, I would find that interesting. I think most people would. And he says, look, I didn't really see anything. And his only defense to that is to say, well, of course, our American cousins to the south, wouldn't brief the Canadian Minister of National Defense on anything that important. And needless to say, I find that stretches credibility. Not the least of reasons, because the Royal Canadian Air Force, for many years in the 1950s and 1960s, was the agency in Canada that was investigating UFO reports and directing UFO reporting using the RCMP, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, and other agencies to help them gather information. So that was within Paul Hellier's ambit of responsibility. He was directly in charge of the Air Force in Canada when he was Minister of Defense. I find it very hard to believe that he didn't see some interesting things cross his desk. So, that's what I make of Mr. Hellier. To me, it's a non-story. The only thing about Mr. Hellier that's a story is that people within ufology have made it a story, which I guess is the story. But what he's saying isn't really
right.
much of a story.
Had we gotten him on tonight, it would have been the fact that, and I would have asked him, I would have said, Mr. Hellier, you picked up a book called The Day After Roswell, you read it, and now you're a believer in this extraterrestrial battle, but why didn't you see anything as the defense minister?
That would be a question that I would ask him, and what I would say to people who bring Mr. Hellier around is Paul Hellier's testimony is worth no more nor no less than anybody else who might have read Philip Corso's book and comes out and says, look, I believe that Corso
or any other book, or any other book. I mean, a U.S. astronaut could have picked up the book and said, oh, I think I believe this. But that doesn't mean that they have firsthand knowledge of what's going on here.
Absolutely. And I think this is one of the fundamental mistakes that ufology makes, or at least certain segments within ufology, and what seems to be a growing segment, unfortunately, within ufology makes. They latch on to somebody like Mr. Hellier because it supports their preconceived belief system. That is that UFOs exist and that UFOs are alien spacecraft. The problem is there are so many good cases out there. I mean, so many good cases that don't get the attention they deserve, that are largely unknown, and instead of focusing in on those, and those are the kind of cases that could draw serious attention, I think, from the scientific community, the journalistic community, even the political community, if properly presented to them in a serious, rational, responsible way. Ufology, or at least a large segment of it today, tends to focus on stories like Philip Corso's and Paul Hellier's appearance on the scene. And even, Project Serpo got a fair amount of play last year and continues to get some play into the new year here in 2006.
Sure.
I think that's a fundamental mistake. I think it's a mistake that ufology made probably about 25 years ago when Roswell started. And I don't think it's a left turn or a right turn, depending on which way you want to go, off the straight and narrow that they should have stayed on. It's not a conscious decision by a large group of people. It just happened to be the way things went. And that's, That's too bad, because there's so much good stuff out there that I think your listeners and everybody else, from the president to the senators to Canadian members of parliament to the world's top scientists, would really be interested and fascinated by, just as my friends are when I explain it to them, if they could actually hear it.
Well, we're going to look forward to talking with you about some of these cases tonight, Paul.
Absolutely.
Here's a story you'll get a kick out of. When I was 21 years old, my very first radio interview in Detroit was with a fellow who came to a university to speak, and we've remained friends, Stanton Friedman, who I have just found out is your uncle.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, he married my Aunt Marilyn about 30 years ago, I guess.
That's a small world.
It is indeed 6 degrees of separation, or I guess in your case, in my case, 1 degree of separation.
Yet you two don't see eye to eye on everything, do you?
No, that's true. And, I always preface my remarks to that effect by saying I have nothing but the greatest respect for Stan and everything he's done over the years, and an immense fondness for him. He was a hoot at family reunions. He still is. In fact, he's not a blood relative, but he knows more about my family than anybody else in my family seems to. So he was a great guy to have around and a really cool uncle, and he still is. And he and Marilyn, his wife, are running the Kimball family reunion this year. And they always put on a good show up in Fredericton. But you're right, we don't see eye to eye on everything. Certainly not on Majestic 12. Probably not on Roswell, although I continue to sit on the fence on that one. Not on Wilbert Smith, and not on the overall concept of a cosmic Watergate, or what Kevin Randall would call the conspiracy of silence. Those are things that we disagree on, and sometimes quite vehemently. Stan took me to task in the MUFON Journal back in May, I guess, for some comments I made about MJ-12 and Wilbert Smith, quite forcefully, and I responded on my blog equally forcefully. But the nice thing is, and this is the way it should be, Stan and I can, as soon as something like that comes out, call each other or meet each other and go, hey, no hard feelings, how's it going, and
sure,
politely move along. And I think that's something else that ufology sometimes is missing. Sometimes it gets terribly personal. I guess every field of endeavor does. But Stan and I, remain the good chums and all that sort of stuff.
You are definitely not a debunker, especially with the work you've been doing and this film that's coming out, Fields of Fear. But you would be considered a skeptic in that you don't believe as quickly as some other people do various UFO stories and cases.
Absolutely. In fact, I think the two most misunderstood terms are debunker and skeptic.
Yes.
I am a debunker if it's bunk. Bunk should be debunked. So I view Philip Corso's book as bunk. It should be debunked. I'm looking at a copy of the Skeptical Inquirer, a sometimes much loathed magazine by
That's Michael Shermer's, right?
Yep.
Yeah, he's
and
been
it's
on before.
from March and April of 1998, and in there is a review of Phil Corso's The Day After Roswell. The review is written by Brad Sparks, a longtime UFO researcher, probably one of the 5 brightest, most knowledgeable researchers in ufology over the last 20 or 30 years. I just interviewed him earlier tonight for our new film, Best Evidence. We're out here in California. And he rips Philip Corso's book a new one, as they say, and that makes him a debunker. Michael Salas called him a debunker. This is the hilarious thing. Michael Salas called Brad Sparks, Kevin Randall, and Stan Friedman debunkers because they went after Philip Corso and some of Exopolitics' other whistleblowers, in quotation marks. I think if somebody's spewing bunk, they should be debunked, and then you don't have to deal with them anymore. I think everybody should be skeptical. I think that's the only way, really, to go about it, to look at each claim as it comes in or each case as it comes in.
It's healthy to be a skeptic, isn't it?
Absolutely. I think so. I quite frankly, I think it's the only way you can be. It's, in many respects, and I might upset some of my evangelical relatives here, but, I consider myself an agnostic with high hopes that it's all real. And the same thing's generally true of UFOs. And I don't see how you can be otherwise, because for me, whether it's religion or UFOs, there is not enough evidence to base a conclusion beyond a reasonable doubt, which in both cases is what I would need, because they're tremendously extraordinary claims. But there is enough evidence, certainly with UFOs, to make me very interested and to keep me interested and to look at all the varying theories, too. I think ufology for too long, especially in the United States, not so much in the United Kingdom or in other countries, has been fixated on the extraterrestrial hypothesis, or what some have come to see as the extraterrestrial fact. And I guess that's the most fundamental difference between Stan and I. Stan views it as the ETF, the extraterrestrial fact. He believes that extraterrestrials or flying saucers have visited Earth, they're still here, probably interacting with humanity in some respect or another. I view it as it's the ETH to me. It's the extraterrestrial hypothesis. It's a very valid, good working hypothesis. There are other very valid, good working hypotheses. Reasonable people can disagree over which one might be more valid, but I don't think you can say that any one has been proved, at least not to my satisfaction. And I don't think if you took the sort of stereotypical 12 reasonable people off the street and presented all the evidence to them, that they would say that it's been proved beyond a reasonable doubt. But beyond a balance of probabilities, 50% plus one, a civil trial standard, well, that might be a different thing.
What do you think of this latest British report that says 30 years of investigating shows that there's nothing to it?
Yeah, the Condon report, a name that was supposedly generated at random, which is amusing in and of itself. I think this is a very good example of how ufology sometimes misses the forest while it's bashing into the trees. As soon as this was mentioned, the four guys who dug the report out in the United Kingdom, Dave Clark, Andy Roberts, Greg or Gary Anthony, I can never remember which, I think it's Gary, and Joe McGonigal, sort of have a very love-hate relationship, shall we say, with American ufology. So they had nothing to do with the report other than to bring it forward. They were the guys who got it released.
Under their Freedom of Information Act.
Exactly.
Guess, right? Okay.
But the initial response from a lot of people on this side of the pond, as it were, was negative, largely because it seemed to be coming from those guys. And plasma was mentioned as sort of the main reason behind UFOs, and the American ufologists tended to jump on that without even reading the full report, I might add. Plasma, bad, evil, we've heard it all before, blah, blah, blah. And this is one of the biggest problems ufology has is PR, basic public relations problems. Because here's what they should have done, and what I did at my blog. You should ignore that. Forget about the conclusion. It's not important. What you should say is a major Western government, the second most powerful, unless the French have been updating their capabilities lately, the second most powerful military power in the Western world, America's closest ally, one of the big five, as it were, still on the UN Security Council with veto power, has actually, their Ministry of Defense, considered UFOs, or UAP as they call them, serious enough to warrant sort of a long-term study. And forget their conclusions. The report says UAP, unidentified aerial phenomenon, exist. They're real. Then the guy says, who wrote the report, well, I think it's this. So what? The important thing is they admit that it's real. To me, that's what ufology should have latched on and said, here's a major Western government saying it's real.
You've got a good news sense about you, Paul, because you're able to look at a story and pick out the lead in it, as we used to do in our days, that modern-day ufologists, who really aren't journalists, can't do.
Yeah, well, it's all about framing, and some people think this is a pejorative sort of way of looking at it, but it's all about framing the message. There's good and bad in everything. The point should be to stress the good and, underplay the stuff that you don't agree with, and in this particular case that didn't make any sense, because people will come out without you yelling and looking sort of somewhat ridiculous. Scientists quickly came out afterwards and said, well, this doesn't make very much sense. Plasma might explain a few UFO sightings, but doesn't really explain this one and this one and this one and this one. And so other people can do that work for you. But what you should be stressing as ufologists is, here's the good stuff. Major Western government saying it's real. Now, they don't say what it is, but they say it's worth study. Obviously, they think it's worth study because
that is dramatic, Paul.
Absolutely. Big story. And it was a story that was largely missed. And I think if ufologists, if their initial reaction had been that, they could have turned the story around and framed it in a different way, and I think that would have been a positive. You put that one in the win column, and instead it was sort of a neutral, or perhaps you might even put it in the loss column. And I think that's a missed opportunity. But that's the history of ufology in the last 25 or 30 years, missed opportunities.
Hey, Paul, when we come back, let's talk a little bit about how you got interested in this, because I understand you're trained as a lawyer, and then we'll get into some of these specific cases that a lot of us should hear about, because we don't hear about them from other sources. We'll be back in a moment. Paul Kimball, our guest on Coast to Coast AM. And our special guest tonight is Paul Kimball. He's a founder of Red Star Films. We're going to talk with him about UFOs in a moment on Coast to Coast AM. Paul, can you tell us, how did you become interested in UFOs? I mean, you've got a very varied background here.
Well, having Stan Friedman at your family reunions is always a good start. That's pretty much guaranteed. I don't know. There's no defining moment, George. I've never seen one. I hadn't really read a lot of books when I was in high school about it. My dad had some books around. Mostly stuff, like Chariots of the Gods and things by Eric von Daniken, and some of Stan's books and some other stuff. I don't know. I must have just read a book somewhere or fallen into it. But Stan probably gets most of the credit because he was always talking, and I always found him an interesting guy. And I found the subject interesting too because it was something that I had an interest in history. My undergraduate degree's in history, and my graduate studies were in history. So that. There's a lot of history in the UFO field, but the legal training as well. And my dad was a criminal court judge for 25 years, give or take. So I grew up in a household where things like evidence and standards of proof were important, and I carried that through into law school. So, all of those factors probably came into play, and I find it's a fascinating field because you've got a lot of cases with a lot of quality, reliable witnesses, but you don't have any hard evidence. And any lawyer will tell you that you'd always like to have the smoking gun, so to speak. But any lawyer will also tell you that it's a challenge and it can be a lot of fun to try and make a case based on circumstantial evidence because it forces you to think and it forces you maybe to work a little harder than you'd have to work if you literally had the smoking gun.
Give us your overall impression, your theory, your belief system, if you would, Paul, about this UFO phenomenon. And that'll allow us, I think, really to get into some of these stories that you're going to tell us about.
No comment. No, sorry. Just kidding.
And UFOs, so we've got 3 more hours to fill after that, right?
UFOs are real, George. I prefer the term UAP, unidentified aerial phenomenon. I think UFO as a term is incorrect because the words flying object imply something that is definitive, basically an alien spacecraft as far as I'm concerned.
You're right.
I think that's a possibility, absolutely, and I'm not afraid to say that on radio or television or wherever else I go. I also think there are other possibilities, and I don't think we know which one of those possibilities is correct. In fact, I was interviewing Mac Tonys in Kansas City, and then he was out traveling with us here in California for a couple of days, just left today. And Mac made a very good point, and I quite agree with it, that these theories, which so many people think of as perhaps mutually exclusive, well, if it's aliens, it can't be extra-dimensional beings. And if it's extra-dimensional beings, it can't be time travelers, and et cetera, are not necessarily all mutually exclusive. 2 of them could be correct. 3 of them could be correct, or frankly, none of them could be correct. And it may be really, we could all explain it as natural phenomena, misidentifications, and other things, perhaps that we don't even know about our own planet and what might be going on in the sky. So I come at it from the view that UAP, is a real objective phenomenon that's worthy of serious scientific, historical, journalistic study. What it is, I don't know. But I think people should take it seriously and should look at it seriously, and I think that's the way forward.
But you, like I believe, whatever it is, because I don't know either, it is definitely happening. How, where, who knows? But there are just too many real episodes of strangeness by people who I feel to be pretty legitimate people, and you just can't sweep it under the carpet.
Absolutely. I fully agree. The only caveat that I would add on that is I don't necessarily believe that there's a paranormal explanation. I believe that that's one possibility, and there are many different ways that you can cut the paranormal cake, if you will, extra-dimensional time travel, all that sort of stuff. And perhaps, if time travel is the answer, it's not paranormal. It's paranormal to us, but it's not paranormal 5,000 years from now.
Well, and you're right, and it could very well be a natural explanation.
Yeah. The truth is, if somebody from the 17th century was 17th century, forget that. If somebody from the 1970s, if me as a kid was to wander into a classroom today, I'd view most of the things that I saw there as paranormal. iPods, computers, the advances we've made in technology in the last 10 years, much less the last 20 and 30, even the last 5, are astounding. When I began my music career in the early 1990s after law school, cassette was it. CDs were just starting to come on the market. Now, I don't know what happened to the CD era, but now everybody's got an iPod. I don't even know, really know what an iPod is.
Well, and you know what? People are downloading their own CDs now. I'm amazed that some of these record stores are still in business.
Absolutely. Although there's probably always a niche.
I should say CD stores. They don't even have records anymore.
I know, although there's probably always a niche market for it for Luddites like me. But I see people walking around with what I call Borg phones, the ones that sort of fit over their ears and almost look like they've been implanted. And maybe that's only 5 years away where you'll actually have it implanted into your body. And in a world of that kind of rapid technological change where the curve seems to be going so far upwards so fast that it's almost bending backwards, the very definition of what's paranormal and what's normal is becoming something that's very hard to sort of get a grasp on. So the things that we see in the sky, the things that credible witnesses have seen in the sky, we might view them as paranormal, but we might not be viewing them as paranormal for very much longer.
You had mentioned when we were talking about Stanton Friedman, MJ-12, which we all listening to Coast and being part of it, understand what it is, and that is that organization that purportedly was set up during the Truman era to investigate UFOs. We know about Stan's views on the cosmic Watergate, but you mentioned Wilbert Smith, and I'm not very familiar with him. Can you tell us about that?
Sure. Wilbert Smith is one of the icons, I suppose, of early ufology. He was a Canadian civil servant in the 1950s, had been for in the 30s and 40s, who supposedly had a meeting with an American scientist named Robert Sarbacher in 1950 while he was down in Washington. Interestingly, Smith was in Washington. He basically cut class. He was in Washington for a radio and broadcast conference, but he had a pre-existing interest in UFOs, so he sought out, as the story goes, through the Canadian Embassy, anybody who would talk to him from the American government or even remotely affiliated with the American government about UFOs. And he wound up with Robert Sarbacher. And Smith came back from that meeting and wrote a memo, which was declassified or discovered in the 1970s, I believe. I think Stan told me by somebody mysteriously named Mr. X. He had his name legally changed to Mr. X, so it was something else before that. Smith, in the memo, which was titled Geomagnetics and was primarily concerned with the study of geomagnetics, stated that Sarbacher told him a number of things about UFOs. One, that it was classified 2 points higher than the H-bomb. 2, that they exist. 3, that the details contained in Frank Scully's book, Behind the Flying Saucers, were essentially correct. There was a top-secret project in the United States being headed by Vannevar Bush, Dr. Vannevar Bush, whose purpose was to discover the modus operandi of UFOs, flying saucers.
Was he related at all to the current Bushes?
No, Van Bush wasn't, no.
Okay.
Not that I know of, certainly not closely, maybe 18
Maybe a distant, okay.
Yeah, but no, I don't think so. Vannevar Bush was America's science czar in the Second World War, an incredibly bright man. But that's one of the fundamental problems with the Wilbert Smith story and one of the fundamental problems with the MJ-12 documents, which cite Bush as one of the key figures in MJ-12. By the time the Roswell crash supposedly happened, by the time Wilbert Smith was supposedly told that Vannevar Bush in 1950 was heading up this top-secret organization, and by the time the MJ-12 documents identify him as one of the key figures in MJ-12, Vannevar Bush was so far out of the loop in Washington, he was in Baltimore, effectively speaking, and perhaps even New York. I mean, he was out there. He was Roosevelt's guy, and this is something that ufologists, including Stan, have chosen to ignore. He was Roosevelt's man, and as soon as Truman came in, he was more of a Roosevelt kind of guy, too, an urbane, sophisticated, intellectual. He was not a Harry Truman kind of backroom politicking guy. And Truman and Bush did not get along. I have a number of columns on my blog that deal with some of the research into Vannevar Bush, there's an excellent biography by Pascal Zachary called Endless Frontier. It's about Vannevar Bush's life. And by 1947-48, Bush was done. He was finished as a major force in Washington. He was not a guy that Harry Truman would have tapped to be on the most secret committee, the most secret project looking into the most highly classified, 2 points higher than the H-bomb, project in the United States. Wouldn't have happened. Couldn't have happened. All the historical evidence points otherwise. That alone, in my mind, is enough to discredit the Wilbert Smith story, and it's enough to discredit the MJ-12 documents. Now, there's many other things that discredit both, but that's a very interesting one that ufologists who support those two stories have chosen to overlook, or maybe they just don't know about. They haven't been reading my blog, I guess.
We've got on our feature article at coasttocoastam.com one of your entries of a strange story that occurred in 1886 in Venezuela. Mm-hmm. Tell us about that.
Well, you got me there. Who did I hear about that one? That wasn't Brad Sparks, I think, turned me on to that one.
Okay, so that's not one of yours.
No. That's one you can find on the web. There's a link on my particular article, which I guess you folks, I've been traveling for a week,
yeah.
so I don't really know what you guys have up there.
We've got an aggressive webmaster, Paul. He grabs everything he finds.
There you go, perfect. It's an interesting story. I put it up at a time when I was looking into cases pre-1947, because that's another thing ufology has done. It's chosen to focus on sort of 1947, Kenneth Arnold Roswell. That's the starting point for UFOs. And it might be for the modern era, but there's a lot of interesting stuff, which may or may not be relevant, but still very interesting, that comes before that. So I was running through a series of columns on my blog about a case in Canada in 1611, where some French missionaries saw what was probably the Aurora Borealis, but still, would have been a UFO report at the time, and you should catalog it and then say probably Aurora Borealis. Some religious figures, and trying to tie in maybe religion and UFOs, and how maybe they're seeing the same thing but just perceiving it differently. Mm-hmm. There's a very good case, a very interesting case anyway, from the Bay of Fundy up in my home province, Nova Scotia, from 1792, 1793, somewhere in the 1790s, where a young girl and two men allegedly saw something that could only be called an airship. In fact, the description that was written down in a journal at the time by a guy named Simeon Perkins, a respected merchant in Nova Scotia who had heard the story secondhand. Perkins's diary is one of the primary historical resources of that time period in Canadian history. He actually notes it in his diary and says, well, I don't necessarily put any credit to it, but here's a story that's going around. Now, it's impossible to go back and investigate that case, but you can still listen to or read what these people were allegedly, supposedly describing and say, well, does this sound like anything else? And it does bear some similarities to the Father Gill sighting in New Guinea in the 1950s here.
Oh, that was a great story, too, and you can tell us about that.
Yeah. It also bears some similarities to the airship sightings in the 1890s in the United States. Not completely, but somewhat of the same kind of similarities. The Father Gill sighting was, he was a missionary, I think he was the Church of England, but I'm not exactly sure, in New Guinea in the 1950s, and he and many of his flock saw what they claimed was a UFO, and basically come flying in, and they could see it had portholes, and they could see people who were supposedly waving at them, as far as I can recall. It's a good case. I'm not sure it's a great case, but it's a very interesting case, and you would think a missionary and his flock would be fairly credible witnesses to something, to having seen something. Whether they misperceive something or not, I don't know. It's not one that I've looked at more than superficially, but guys like Jerry Clark, for instance, could natter on for an hour about the Father Gill case. And his UFO encyclopedia contains all of these things, or most of them, and it's a wonderful resource that if you're truly serious in the subject, you should probably have sitting on your bookshelf somewhere.
What year did the dirigibles come out? I don't remember that. But do you think it was after the period that these people were seeing these kinds of airships?
I'm not an expert on that particular subject, but my understanding from talking to people who are is that they were coming at it about the same time. That the dirigibles, the Zeppelins, whatever you want to call them, were being developed in the late 19th century, or at least being thought of. So I talked to a couple of people who said that they believe they were secret that people actually did see some things. Some of them were hoaxes, but some people actually saw some things. And they were top secret. You know, it's kind of like saying the flying triangles are American government experiments now.
Exactly.
The airship stories of the late 19th centuries may have been top secret American government experiments then too. I don't know. Not my area of expertise.
Yeah.
Just something that I sort of look into in passing, as it were.
I mean, they may have been seeing prototypes all over the place.
Could be. I'm always kind of loath to comment on things that I don't know very well, but it's worth looking into. And that my entire point with the Venezuelan case, but also with looking back into the sightings in Nuremberg with the wood carvings from 1553, I think, or 1563, somewhere in there anyway, in the mid 1500s. That's referenced in Carl Jung's book. All of these things, Ezekiel's wheel, Emperor Constantine seeing the burning cross before the battle, all of this stuff is grist for the mill, and it's worth looking into. And Stan and I have had a number of conversations. Stan says Sodom and Gomorrah. Sodom and Gomorrah could have been a nuclear blast. When they say
could have been
bright light was shone in their eyes, could have been lasers. So, where some people see religious explanations, Stan sort of sometimes sees UFO explanations. I don't know. But it's worth remembering that there's a longer history to the UFO phenomenon than just 1947 and beyond, that things were happening for centuries, perhaps even thousands of years before that. And it's always good to keep an eye on the big picture, even as you're trying to move forward.
Your film, Best Evidence, Top 10 UFO Cases, when were you done with that one?
We're shooting now. I'm off to Washington, D.C. tomorrow to interview Bruce Maccabee and a couple of other folks.
So tell them hi for me, by the way.
I will. Dick Hall. We're going to be talking to Dick Hall as well. And a witness that I can't name, because if I named him, you'd know which case is on the list, and I'd ruin the surprise.
I understand.
But he's a former military officer, that's all I'll say, and it's a really good case. We go home for about a week, then we're off to the United Kingdom, where I'm speaking at a conference being put on by Stuart Miller of UFO Review up in Manchester, and then interviewing Nick Pope and Nick Redfern and looking at some cases over there. Do the Yukon in July. Oops, I think I might have just given away what one of the cases is. I'll be up in the Yukon in July. And then that's pretty much it. Post-production, we should be done by late September or sometime in October. It's set to air on Canadian TV Space, which is our sci-fi channel for Americans listening. That's basically what Space is. Sometime probably in the late fall. It's already been pre-sold to Television New Zealand, so if there's anyone listening down under, as it were, hello. And that documentary will be coming to you sometime over the next year, half year. And hopefully we have a distributor out of the United Kingdom that's working very hard to try and get it sold into as many markets as possible so as many people as possible can see it.
Right now, where do you stand with Fields of Fear, the film about cattle mutilations?
Well, I was supposed to have that done 3 months ago.
So you're working on a couple films right simultaneously?
Yep, and actually we're in pre-production for a third documentary that I start shooting when I get back from the Fields of Fear, the Best Evidence journey, that has nothing to do with UFOs. It's about classical music.
My gosh, Paul, how do you keep them all together here?
I don't know. My fiancée keeps asking me the same thing, usually by phone. She's usually saying, why aren't you home? But she works in the industry, too, so she understands.
We're going to end up with a UFO show that might have some classical music in it.
I've been thinking about that, actually, seeing if I could bring the two together. But the Fields of Fear one is interesting, and maybe in the next segment, I don't even know what time it is. We can talk about that and Fern Belzil and cattle mutilations. But Best Evidence, too. I'd like to talk about that and maybe some of the cases that may or may not be on the list.
Yeah, we can do that. Does anybody ever, Paul, talk about occupants and ETs? I mean, we get all these stories about craft. Mm-hmm. What about the beings themselves? Because that fascinates me.
Sure, absolutely. There are no well, who knows? Maybe they are occupants. I don't know. There are no occupant cases on our top 10 list that we developed through a poll with a number of leading ufologists, which might tell you something. The best UFO researchers in the world tend not to favor those cases, usually because they're single witness cases. Not always, but usually.
True.
We actually set a very stringent criteria for the film. You needed to have multiple witnesses, and multiple witnesses could include one witness backed up by corroborating evidence from, say, radar or physical evidence or something like that. Photographs could work too. But it couldn't just be one guy or one gal saying such and such came to me and I saw this happen and off we go. Maybe it did, but those are not the best cases. Unique cases that have multiple witnesses or corroborating evidence. Those are the best cases.
All right, let's talk about both those films when we come right back on Coast to Coast AM. I'm George Norrie. You know, I want to believe that we've been visited by extraterrestrials. I want to believe that we are not alone in the universe. Remember that book by Walter Sullivan, We Are Not Alone? I want to believe all that. Then there's this little part of me, this teeny little part of me that says, George, we are alone. There is no one else. And that's kind of a lonely feeling, isn't it? We'll be back in a moment with our special guest, Paul Kimball, on Coast to Coast AM. Paul, this question, are we alone in the universe, which perplexes all of us, it is a lonely question. Do you have that same feeling that I do? I mean, it's kind of disappointing if we are.
Well, I have to say, George, even if we are, I just saw on ESPN that the Edmonton Oilers beat the Anaheim Ducks 5-4 tonight. So as a Canadian who hasn't seen a Canadian team win the Stanley Cup since '93, whether I'm alone or not, I feel good.
Yeah, because they beat my Detroit Red Wings as well, didn't they?
Sorry about that. I'm not even an Oilers fan, but all Canadians come together about very few things, and hockey is one of them. So, especially when we're traveling in the States. The other thing I'd like to add before I answer that question, going back to your question about occupant cases in the last segment, I was remiss. It didn't make our top 10 list, but I sort of said that no occupant cases received any real votes. The Betty and Barney Hill case did. Didn't make the list, so there's a clue it's not in the top 10, but it wasn't far from the top 10. Because it had multiple witnesses, it met our criteria. That's one that a lot of ufologists still rate very highly, and it's the one alien abduction case, and I'm very leery of the abduction phenomenon, but it's the one that I can't completely dismiss and the one that I still find interesting. So just wanted to clarify that. Occupant cases, we did have one that ranked very highly on our list.
Well, it is fascinating, too, that the one occupancy case that really started it all in terms of abductions still continues to be the best case of all of them.
Yeah, and it's interesting, too, because Betty Hill, and I talked about this in a blog column that I did some months ago, was always very, very critical of the modern abduction researchers, Bud Hopkins and others, and very, very critical of hypnosis, even though she underwent hypnosis herself. She called it medical. What she underwent was medical hypnosis, and she had a disparaging view, and there's an interview in a magazine, the name of which I can't remember, but it's on my blog somewhere, where she basically really went after the modern abduction researchers, and I always found that interesting too. That sort of combativeness on her part, whether that was my case was first and I wanted to remain special, or I think you guys are all nuts, and you've turned this into an industry when in fact these are relatively unique and rare cases. I think my favorite quote from hers is, you should be very careful about people messing around in your mind. And that didn't come from a debunker, and it didn't come from a skeptic. It came from Betty Hill, perhaps the original abductee, or if not the original one, the best-known one. So very interesting. Are we alone in the universe? No. That's a short answer.
It is a short answer. Why do you believe that? You're a skeptic.
Well, I'm a skeptic as to whether any of them are coming here, and I'm a skeptic as to what the nature of life in the universe might be like, and that's a wide-open question. But the universe is a big place. Our galaxy is big enough, but the universe goes, forever. And I find it incomprehensible to believe that in this vast universe, we're it in terms of life. We might be it in terms of intelligent life. I don't know. But there's got to be life elsewhere. The odds alone favor that. I think you'd be hard-pressed to find a scientist today who would say categorically there is no other life in the universe, we're it. I think you'd be hard-pressed to find very many scientists who would say on the balance of probabilities we think there isn't life in the universe. I think most scientists think there's some life out there somewhere. Some scientists, I think, even believe that maybe it's come here.
But they're basing it without proof.
Well, Yeah, which is why I wouldn't say it's absolutely 100% proved, but I think the odds are in favor. And I've been to Vegas enough to know that you should always play the odds. And I play poker every
smart.
2 weeks.
In Vegas, that's very smart.
Yeah, it seems to be smart in my biweekly poker game, too, although not always as smart as I think it is.
Well, what do you play, Texas Hold'em?
Oh, yeah, everybody plays Texas Hold'em now.
That's huge.
Haven't won in a couple of weeks, so but I have won, and I always try and play the odds. And the odds say that there is life out there. Can we prove it? No. Best way to prove it, and where we've really fallen down over the last 35 years, is to go out there. That's one of the things that ufology, I believe, could have really benefited from doing, was trying to tie itself to the space exploration drive in the late 1960s into the 70s, and should be pushing for it today. If George Bush, no matter what you think of him, says, we want to go back to the moon and then on to Mars, everybody should line up behind him and say, absolutely, Mr. President, and whoever your successors are, because it won't be him that,
it won't be him. That's right.
There when it happens. You're darn right. We should be going back to the moon. We should never have left. And then we should be continuing on to Mars, and we should be continuing on after that. But if you look at the history of European exploration of North America, when the first explorers arrived, there tended to be a period afterwards where not much happened before they started to come in waves. And I think that's probably what happened with us when we went to the moon. We got there, we took a look around, said, interesting. Came back home and said, well, maybe we should look after, the problems that are taking place here, the Vietnam War at the time, the oil crisis in the 70s, and we got distracted. And there's plenty of things in this planet to distract us now. But I think we can find the resources somewhere to get a serious space program in place that doesn't just put shuttles bouncing around in our atmosphere and building space stations that don't really make much scientific sense, and say, there's answers out there, there's resources out there that we might be able to exploit if that's what you're into, if you believe the Earth needs more resources, and it probably does. Let's go out and see what's happening. It's what sets us apart from the rest of the animals, our inquisitive nature to explore. And it's been a big mistake not to go, and I think ufology could really benefit, and some ufologists do, from trying to link themselves with the space movement and say, maybe the best way to find out if they're coming here is for us to start going out there. Who knows who we'll meet?
Paul, the mother of my children, my ex-wife, was born in Canada. She was born in Windsor, so I've got a very closeness with Canadians, and maybe one of the few talk show hosts in the country to talk about this relationship, this true relationship between Canada and the United States. Even though so many people feel as if there's tension and things, there is remarkably an affection, a brotherhood between our people that is unmatched. But let me ask you a silly question that I really don't know. One is why haven't we ever worked together in any specific space endeavors? And two, do you have nuclear weapons? Does Canada have them?
No, not that any Canadians know of. We did test cruise missiles, and we tested in the 50s and 60s Beaumark missiles. I believe they were Beaumarks. Canada certainly has the capability, far faster than Iran. We could build nuclear missiles if we wanted to. We have nuclear reactors. Stan Friedman has worked on one in New Brunswick at the Point Lepreau nuclear reactor project. So, obviously, as an industrialized first world nation, we have that capability. We don't have those weapons. In terms of the space program, Canada and the United States have worked very closely. Every time you send a shuttle up and the arm comes out, Americans should remember who built that. We did. That's our arm. In Canada, we actually call it the Canadarm. We've sent astronauts up. The first Canadian in space, I believe, was Marc Garneau. He's certainly the most famous. He recently ran for the Liberal Party in our last election a few months ago, lost, unfortunately. I generally don't support the Liberals anymore, but I supported him because I thought he would have been a fine member of Parliament, a true Canadian hero. And he's worked with Canada's space agency. We do have one. It works closely with NASA. I believe it probably works closely with the European Space Agency.
But you've never launched anything on your own, right?
No. I think Canadians, generally speaking, tend to be cooperative people. We like to build partnerships with others. The United States has far more resources than we can bring to bear. So why not piggyback on the American space program and bring certain elements of our own ingenuity, our own industriousness to the project, which is basically what we've done militarily as well over the years. Canadians, we can field a very large army and navy if we really wanted to. We did in the Second World War. When the war was over, we had the fourth largest navy in the world. Very few people remember that. We actually had aircraft carriers. But, we don't do that. Instead, what we do is we do things like mine sweeping, and we take on peacekeeping chores that maybe the Americans don't want to do or don't feel they're suited to do, and provide brigades, as we do now in Afghanistan, to help lighten the load there. So we make our contributions usually as part of a much greater coalition or a greater partnership or whatever term you want to use, and I believe we've done that with the space program as well. It's the stereotypical Canadian way. We like to work with people.
Okay, well, there's nothing wrong with that. All right, let's talk about your two films. First of all, Best Evidence. Some cases you obviously can't tell us about. They're in the film. You don't want to reveal that to us right now. But tell us about some great cases that you like.
Well, there's no question that one of the best cases of all time is the RB-47 case from 1957. And I was interviewing Brad Sparks about that case tonight, and I'll make no bones about it. That one I'll reveal. The RB-47 case is on the top 10. Where it fits in the top 10, I won't say. But it's definitely on the top 10 somewhere, and it is uniformly regarded by ufologists, I think, as one of the best cases that there is out there, which might give you a clue as to which half hour it's going to wind up in the special.
Exactly.
It's an amazing case. The RB-47 was one of the United States' top surveillance planes in the 1950s and 1960s, saw extensive duty around the world in some very tight hot spots, had the best electronic sensor gear extant during the day, top-notch crews. I mean, these were the creme de la creme of the Air Force that were flying these things and that were serving as electronic warfare officers, listeners. They called them Ravens for some reason. I think it's because they took it from a British term. The British called them crows or something like that. And these guys, in this particular case, a training mission over the Gulf of Mexico, Louisiana, Mississippi, Texas too, I think, and then up into Oklahoma, were tailed basically by a UFO. I sort of call the case the tailgater. They were tailed basically by a UFO for almost 2 hours. They tracked it on their equipment in their plane. It was tracked by radar on the ground. The pilots saw it as a bright light. It's just simply an amazing case that not enough people know about, and it's going to be a real pleasure to bring that one forward. The interesting thing is it's not the only RB-47 case out there. There are others that are even less well-known, but just as interesting. I talked with I should make one other point about the RB-47 case. Sorry, the famous one, the 1957 one, famous among some ufologists at least, if not the general public. The guys, the crew that were in that plane were the creme de la creme of the creme de la creme. They were an older crew. Two of the electronic countermeasures officers, or they name, the guys working the gear and the guts of the plane, were guys who trained other people. So these were guys that were highly thought of by even their own peers within the RB-47, within the 55th Air Surveillance Squadron. I think it's air surveillance. Sometimes I get my military terms mixed up. But you can check on my blog. There it is. These were good guys, and this was a great plane, and that's the kind of, with radar sighting it on the ground, a prolonged sighting that nobody could explain. There's no explanation that's ever been offered by anyone. That's the kind of case that you just go, okay, if you're a skeptic, and I'm a skeptic, about the ETH at least, you've got to sort of at least sit back and go, well, there's definitely something up there. Now we sort of we're beyond that hurdle, so now let's try and figure out what it is. And I think, for me, I'm at the point of trying to figure out what it is. Other people have gone further than that. They already think they know what it is. That's a leap that I'm not prepared to make yet. But that case alone, as far as I'm concerned, is enough to prove that there's an objective reality to the UFO phenomenon.
Do you touch in Best Evidence any astronaut cases or things that they think they may have found on the moon? Who knows what?
Yes, there is going to be one astronaut case on the list, and that one I will keep secret. But yeah, there is an astronaut case on the list, one that probably isn't talked about as much as it should be. It's very difficult to track down. You can find it in one or two books. It involves photographs, which might be a clue for some people. But it's a good case, and it's on the list, yeah.
How do you feel, Paul, about There's so many stories that we hear that government is holding back. They're not disclosing. They're not going to tell us what's going on. Do you believe that to be true, or could you say as a skeptic, come on now, they don't say anything because they don't know anything?
Well, I think it's absolutely true that the government has withheld information. The question is, what information have they withheld, and for what reason have they withheld it? And that's where I differ from the people who believe in things like, the cosmic Watergate.
Sure.
I believe that...
Your uncle.
Exactly. I believe that if the government's withholding information, it might be for national security reasons that really do relate, in some cases, to sources and methods and things like that. And in other cases, I believe the government's withholding information because they're just plumb embarrassed that they don't know what's going on. I honestly don't believe that the government knows what's going on. I believe they're embarrassed to admit that the air forces, either in Britain or Canada or the United States or wherever they are, can't control our skies, that there's something up there, whether it's a natural phenomenon or aliens from space or whatever it is, that they just can't explain. And I think it's understandable that if that's the case, they would be unwilling to admit that they can't explain it. So they try and explain it away, which is what the U.S. Air Force did for many years, or they just ignore it altogether. But I don't think I've seen no evidence. I don't believe that there's massive cover-up to reverse engineer alien technology. I'm not a believer in the crash flying saucer tales. I don't think any of those are real. Certainly none have been proved to my satisfaction. I don't believe the government's got UFO technology stashed at Area 51. No. But is the government covering something up? Yes. I think what they're covering up, and this should be easier for people to believe, given the events of the last few years, I believe they're covering up their own general incompetence and their own failure to come to grips with the phenomenon, whatever it is. So you see something like the British report come out where, again, they say, well, plasma, and I generalize, but, basically trying to explain it away, even as they admit it exists. And that, to me, is very telling, very telling.
Stephen Greer, whom you, I'm sure, know about,
yes.
Pulled out at this Toronto exopolitics meeting a week or so ago, pulled out Paul Hellyer in Toronto.
Yes.
And, I don't think he should have done that for the reasons we've already talked about. He has, however, accumulated some pretty good people who claim that some very strange things have happened.
Absolutely. I've interviewed at least one of those people recently. There's another clue, although it's a very long list of people. So I asked that person when I interviewed them what they thought of Dr. Greer, not on camera, but between he and me, and he just rolled his eyes. He was part of the Disclosure Project, one of the witnesses who came forward, former military officer, and he was sorry he ever got involved with it. I've interviewed Dr. Greer many years ago, 2001, didn't use it in the film because I didn't want to undermine the credibility of the film I was doing at the time. I think Dr. Greer has been a bane on ufology. I think he's been one of the worst things that's happened. I think
you do.
Dick Hall has made the point over and over and over again that there was some movement towards congressional hearings on the UFO subject in the 1990s, which effectively came to a screeching halt when Stephen Greer began his Disclosure Project. Because what he did was he took good witnesses, and there were a number of good witnesses within the Disclosure Project, but unfortunately he mixed them in with a number of bad witnesses. And you're only as good as the weakest link in your chain. And so if the weakest link in your chain is a UFO nutball who says he's been talking with aliens from Venus, I paraphrase, of course, but somebody who is not credible, and there were a number of people at the Exopolitics Disclosure Group tout as legitimate witnesses that serious ufologists, including Stan, Kevin Randall, Dick Hall, Brad Sparks, Jerry Clark, will tell you these people have no credibility. You mix those people in with people that are credible witnesses, and the people who suffer are the credible witnesses. And I think Dr. Greer has done a great disservice to the serious study of the UFO phenomenon over the last 10 years or so.
So maybe in his effort, his zeal to get something done, Paul, he went a little too far, you think?
Well, I think you go a little too far when you start charging people hundreds of dollars to wander around fields at night waving flashlights at the sky trying to bring down alien spaceships, too. That's the kind of stuff that ufology doesn't need if it wants to be taken seriously by science, by the dreaded mainstream, by anybody, quite frankly.
I like you, Paul. I'll be back with you in just a moment on Coast to Coast AM. Well, our condolences to Peter, who lives in Arizona, because he has just returned from New York at the loss of his father, who he says used to listen to Coast religiously every night, so much so Peter is now a fan of the program. Peter, just want to let you know that part of the family, we give you and yours a full condolences on that. Next hour, we'll open up the phone lines to give you an opportunity to chat with Paul Kimball, but when we come right back, we'll chat with him about some of his work, some of his films. That's next on Coast to Coast AM. Well, Paul, before we talk about the Fields of Fear film that you've been working on one of your blogs, you wrote a story about some of the top 10, top worst in ufology's history. Jacques Vallée heads the list. Edward Condon, he's on the bottom. Let's talk a little bit about that.
Sure. Everybody loves top 10 lists. Obviously, I'm doing a film on it, so I thought these were mine. I later ran a poll, actually, too, that had, I think, around 200 people voted, that said which ufologist on this long list is the top one, and Vallée won that poll, too, which is very interesting to me. Where is Jacques Vallée? Well, I know where he is. He's up in San Francisco. But why is Vallée not part of ufology anymore, or at least not part of ufology in an ongoing way?
Well, and he doesn't seem to want to.
Exactly.
As a matter of fact, Paul, I've been trying to get him on the program. He doesn't want to go there anymore.
Yeah, and I think a large part of that is because he was driven away by the extraterrestrial hypothesis people, the believers in ET, who couldn't countenance somebody who would think outside the box and start looking at other possible explanations. Now, I don't want to speak for Dr. Vallée. I've corresponded with him a couple of times, very friendly, and he's been helpful. And I think he continues to do that on a more personal basis, and perhaps he is even working through what he called the Invisible College. But Jacques Vallée was a tremendous resource to ufology, truly one of its deep thinkers, and sort of losing him from the ongoing development of ufology, of ufological studies, of serious scientific research into ufology, I think was a great loss. And I think that's what happens when you become too wedded to one particular theory, when they are all still theories, and you start driving people like Vallée away. In the case of Condon, it's interesting. In the last half hour there I was criticizing Stephen Greer, and I'm a frequent critic of exopolitics, and I think Dr. Greer was on my list of the top 10 worst of all time. But at number one was Dr. Edward Condon. And, Condon was by no means a UFO believer or somebody like Billy Meyer, perhaps, that tends to have these wild, outlandish tales. He was a serious scientist who commissioned a report, or didn't commission a report, but the Air Force commissioned a report that he authored, the Condon, the University of Colorado study, and then the Condon report, which is one of the defining moments in ufological history, because it basically set the tone for the next 40 years. He came out and he said, there's nothing to this. It can all be explained, even the ones that we actually can't explain. I'm sure those can be explained. There's no scientific merit to this. Go away. And there's no coincidence. I've talked about this on my blog. If you look at the records of the Canadian House of Commons, for instance, which I have, very few people have, but I have. I've gone through them in the 50s and 60s. There were a number of members of Parliament who took UFOs seriously. They asked questions about particular cases, the Stephen Michalek case in particular, but they also asked questions about UFOs in general every now and then. Yes, they made a few jokes about them too, but I actually make a few jokes about UFOs sometimes, so does Stan. But it was being taken seriously by some serious people in Canada's government, parliamentarians. They would ask questions in the House of Commons. And then as soon as the Condon report came out, basically nothing.
That was it, yeah. Shut it down.
There's been one question in the House of Commons since about UFOs, and it was in the 1970s, and the question was basically, why did you give $6,000 to this guy to write a report on the history of UFOs? And it was, like, what a waste of money. Because they said, fine, the U.S. Air Force, through this distinguished scientist, Edward Condon, in this study, has explained UFOs. So why there's nothing more to talk about, is there? And that, I think, is why Condon ranks as the worst person in the history of ufology. He's not a fraud. He's not a huckster. He's not a hoaxer. He's just a guy who sort of a turning point in history, and he turned it the wrong way for any one of a number of reasons. And people can speculate about what those reasons were, but I just think he got it wrong, and he was predisposed to get it wrong because he didn't think much of UFOs. The interesting thing is, in the late 1990s, another distinguished scientist, Dr. Peter Sturrock, put together a group of scientists for a much shorter period of time, the Sturrock panel, and he invited ufologists to come in and present what they considered some of the best evidence. I think Vallée was one of them, and Mark Rodiger from QFOS was another, and there were Michael Swords, and there were many others. And the Sturrock panel, which a lot of pro-ET ufologists kind of went, sort of said, look, none of these cases prove that these things are extraterrestrials. Fine. That annoyed a lot of ufologists.
Sure.
But what they missed, again, forest, trees, they seem to always hit the trees and miss the forest, is that the Sturrock panel, in particular Dr. Sturrock, came forward and said, we still believe this is worthy of serious scientific study. The Condon report got it wrong. Even though there's no proof that this is extraterrestrial, there are things up there that we should be looking at. Science might learn something from this. And who knows? Maybe I don't think Sturrock ever said this, but the implication was, I don't know, maybe they are extraterrestrial. We won't know until we look. And he set out a very sort of, they set out a very relatively rigid set of criteria for how the study of the UFO phenomenon should proceed. So on my blog, what I did is I wrote two columns. I wrote one called The Condon Effect, which I think ufology has been suffering from for almost 40 years, a chilling effect. And then I wrote, look, here's how you combat the Condon effect. I called it the Sturrock Gambit, but the better way to put it probably would have been, that's kind of the clever turn of the phrase, but the better way, the Sturrock approach. And just type in Sturrock, Sturrock, in my blog, and you'll read about what the Sturrock approach is. I think that's the approach that ufology should be taking. Good way to start would be to mail every member of Parliament or every member of the House of Representatives and the Senate down here at least one chapter from Dick Hall's UFO Evidence, Volume 2. Probably the one on military sightings, because I think most people believe that military service personnel are pretty credible witnesses. Mail them that chapter, get Dick's permission to photocopy it, and send it to all of them. And say, look, Congressman, Member of Parliament, read this, or have your assistant read it. I guarantee you somebody's going to read it. Not all of them, but somebody will read it, and they might actually look at it and go, Also mail them a copy of the Sturrock panel report. Don't gloss things over. Admit, yeah, they didn't say it was ET, but point out and highlight the sections where they say we need serious, sustained scientific study of that, which requires government money. Either that or you get a very big series of private investors, but it probably requires government resources and government money. Now, if you believe the government's covering everything up and they're in league with the aliens and all that, this is not the approach for you. As far as I'm concerned, you're lost already, at least to people like me. However, if you haven't gone to that extent yet, then the Sturrock approach is the way forward, because it will lead to a serious, sustained scientific study. The French are already starting one up again through their space
they
agency,
are. Good.
CNES. I believe, I can't remember what his exact position was. It's a committee, but the guy who's heading it, I think, is the former director of scientific intelligence for NATO. I may have that wrong. It's on my blog. I got it right on the blog. That's an interesting development in 2005 that very few people talked about. But I did a list of the top 10 things that happened in 2005, and I put that at number 2. Because any time a government takes the UFO phenomenon seriously, or a government agency, that's cause for, if not rejoicing, at least interest. So, yeah, the Sturrock approach, the way forward, and get rid of the Condon effect, which, we've been languishing under for 40 years.
Is J. Allen Hynek on your list at all?
Absolutely. I think he was at number 2.
Yeah.
Stan calls him an apologist ufologist. Stan's great with the turn of a phrase. I just think that's absolutely wrong. I think Hynek was one of the great figures in UFO history, one of the unsung heroes of ufology. Everybody knows about him, but every time you hear Hynek's name, you usually hear in the same sentence swamp gas.
Yes, you do.
And I think that's a shame. It's everybody can make a mistake. He made one. He owned up to it. He said,
he admitted it, and he changed his mind.
Absolutely. He said, I goofed, and he moved, and, fine. focus in on that? But I think the reason pro-ET ufologists sometimes don't like Hynek is because he wouldn't come out as forcefully as they would want and scream from the rooftops that UFOs are extraterrestrial. Towards the later years of his life, he became more inclined, I guess, to that view.
Well, his book, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, which was what Spielberg based his movie on, tells you right there that he was a believer.
Yeah, as he moved along, but even then, towards the later years of his life, I think he moved away from the extraterrestrial hypothesis and started considering maybe perhaps more extra-dimensional type stuff. He was a very open-minded guy. I have a great deal of respect for Hynek. I never call him an apologist ufologist, with all respect to Stan. I think he was one of the top 10, and I put him at number 2, and I think on the poll I conducted, he came in at number 2 as well. James McDonald was another, Dr. James McDonald, one of the giants of ufology that very few people outside ufology know about now, which is a shame. Stan's another one. Stan is, when the Peter Jennings special came out, he was referred to as a Roswell promoter, and everybody, including Stan, took offense. I didn't. I think it's an accurate term because he does promote Roswell. Now, I know people said the pejorative angle on that is he's doing it for the bucks, but that's one way of looking at it. I look at it as Stan is a very effective promoter of the extraterrestrial hypothesis, of the cause that UFOs are real and should be taken seriously. I've seen him give a number of lectures. I think in Stan's case, promoter is a good word to use, and I mean it when I use it at least, if not the Jennings people, in the kindest possible way, because every field of study needs somebody like that, a popularizer, somebody who can speak to large bodies of people effectively and intelligently. Carl Sagan,
very good at that.
The funny thing is, Carl Sagan was very good at it too, and both of them went to the same university together, and they held radically different views about what UFOs might represent, but they both had something in common in that they could speak to large groups of people and make them understand the concepts that they were talking about. And the thing that I hope Stan goes back to, and I think he is, I've heard rumors from Stan that he's working on a book about science and UFOs. And I think for far too long, Stan's been talking, and if you're listening, Stan, don't hold this against me, we're still pals, but Stan's been talking about government cover-up, cosmic Watergate, Roswell, and MJ-12. And I think that's a mistake Stan made a number of years ago. And if he is going to go back and write a book, I really hope he does, and I hope somebody publishes it, and I hope it sells a lot of copies, on the science of UFOs, because Stan is a scientist. And I think he'd be a good guy to write that book, so I hope he does it.
You remember the movie, though, Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Wasn't the Frenchman in the movie based on the life of Jacques Vallée?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was based loosely, as I understand it, on Vallée. Yeah.
Okay.
It's an interesting film. And stories around it, like, was it screened for, President Reagan? And he said, you have no idea how true this might be. I don't believe any of that sort of stuff. But, yeah, it's a film. But people should remember that films are films. They're fictional stories. And if you can find a kernel of truth in a fictional story, it might sometimes be by accident. But there are people out there that look at Close Encounters of the Third Kind and view it as a documentary, and it's not. On the other hand, there are people out there that believe Independence Day and Men in Black are documentaries. They're not either. They're fictional films. So, but yeah, Vallée, Jim Moseley. There's another one. Very few people might cite Jim Moseley as one of the great figures of ufology, but every field of study needs a court jester, and Jim Moseley, who's been around for 50 years, currently publishing Saucer Smear, is one of my favorites, so he'd make the list too. Dick Hall was another one. Dick's one of the icons of ufology. Who
was number 9, right above Condon?
Phil Klass.
The late Phil Klass.
Klass made both lists. He made the top 10 ufologists of all time, or the top 10 ufological figures, and the bottom 10. He made the top 10 for me simply because you couldn't ignore him. He had a profound impact on the field, for good or ill, sometimes for good. People forget that. Perhaps more often than not for ill. But what Klass did, and every field, like they need a court jester, everybody needs a devil too. And if Klass hadn't existed, somebody would have had to invent somebody like Klass, or somebody else would have come along. He forced ufologists, and Bruce Maccabee has talked about this, to refine their research, to cross the T's and dot the I's, if for no other reason than to make sure that Phil Klass couldn't pick them apart, and to cover their bases. And I think it was Maccabee that said that, but Kevin Randall said the same sort of thing. Others have too. So he could be disagreeable sometimes. He could be vicious sometimes, especially when he attacked James MacDonald many years ago. But by all accounts, he was quite pleasant in person. I never met him. But he performed a valuable service. And I think people maybe missed that when he passed away recently, last year. And some of the people who came forward were less than kind. You should never speak ill of the dead. But in Klaas's case, I think in particular, they just sort of missed the boat in that he should exist. People like him should exist because by confronting people like him, it makes your own research better, stronger, and that's important. But there are better skeptics out there than Phil Klaas in terms of just pure talent and in terms of their reasoning, too.
Isn't it interesting how that those people on your top list have devoted, or they had devoted, their lives to trying to uncover this entire situation?
Yeah, absolutely. Jim and Cora Lorenzen from APRO were on the list, too. They devoted a large portion of their lives to it. I don't know if Jim MacDonald, for instance, devoted his entire life, but he devoted the last few years of his life to it, and it was a large part of his life. Valet obviously has other interests, many other interests, but he devoted a large part of his life to it. Certainly Hynek did. Certainly Stan has. Certainly Jim Moseley has. Dick Hall, too. These are people that as ufology moves forward, none of these people are young anymore. Some of them are dead, like the Lorenzens and now Phil Klaas. Stan is in his 70s. I think Valet's in his late 60s or 70s. Dick Hall is in his 70s. You can go down the list. The ones that are alive, unfortunately, won't be with us much longer, relatively speaking, unless we can download their intelligence into cyborg bodies, which is a whole different
we can't do that yet. No, but is there a crop, Paul, of younger people, younger Stanton Friedmans, younger J. Allen Hyneks, younger Jacques Valets, who will pick up and run with this?
It's interesting. In terms of the scientists, and you just mentioned Jacques Vallée, Hynek, MacDonald, Friedman, all scientists, I honestly don't know. You don't see very many of them out there in the ufological community.
No.
I think there are a number of them who are interested behind the scenes. But there are a number of people out there who are doing very good work. I disagree with him sometimes, but he's a close friend of mine, Nick Redfern. People think that sometimes maybe Nick just writes books, but Nick also digs out documents and does a lot of good research. And while I disagreed with him completely about his Body Snatchers in the Desert book, I've read other things by him that I quite like, and he worked with us on the Fields of Fear project with the cattle mutes. Mac Tonys, you can see his stuff at mactonys.com. Very bright young fellow, 30 years old. I think he's got a new book that he's hoping to have come out in a year or two about crypto-terrestrials as a possible theory behind UFOs.
Oh,
and he's a really bright guy, and he wrote a book on the face on Mars and blogs regularly at a blog called Posthuman Blues. Two others that I'd mention would be Greg Bishop, who wrote what I thought was the best UFO book of last year, Project Beta, the Benowitz story, which was, I think, criminally overlooked by ufologists in general, largely because it contained some truths that I think they were uncomfortable in confronting sometimes, namely that they've been disinformed by the government over and over again for reasons that usually have nothing to do with UFOs, and they just don't want to admit that maybe they've been taken for a ride by certain people within the government. And I think Greg's book makes that point really well, and I think it's a book that more people should read.
What about the young kid, John Greenwald? Does he have a future?
I like John Greenwald. John Greenwald, you need people to go dig stuff out. It's not terribly hard. You just need to be persistent. It's hard in the sense that you need to spend a lot of time, sometimes some money, and you need to be persistent at it. But once you get good at it, and John, who I interviewed a few years ago, when he was even younger, very bright young guy, yeah, sure, he has a future in ufology, as long as he stays away from conspiracy theory too much, and he sticks on the straight and narrow. I'll mention one more real quick. William Wise, who runs the Project Blue Book Archive, great resource on the web, and he's in his 30s. He's a very bright young guy, too, out of Virginia.
Great.
Keep an eye on him.
Cattle mutilations in Canada. We're going to talk about that and take your phone calls next on Coast to Coast AM. Okay, we're going to talk about this cattle mutilation situation in Canada. Then we'll take your phone calls right here on Coast to Coast AM with our guest, Paul Kimball. Don't go away. Paul, the cattle mutilation story in Canada. Now, this one intrigues me. How long have you been investigating it? What led you into this film, Fields of Fear?
I got to tell you first, George, it's great to be sort of played in by the Zombies. That's cool. One of my favorite bands. Cattle mutilations. Well, Fern Belzile, whenever you make a film in Canada, it always helps to have a Canadian angle. That's a long story. But I was originally looking at making a film about chupacabras, actually. And it was sort of indicated to me that maybe chupacabras had been done, if not to death, then perhaps, to a slow roast. And if I could find a Canadian angle to sort of mutilation stories of some sort, the network would be amenable to that. And so I took a look, and I ran across Fern Belzile up there in northern Alberta, St. Paul, which is about an hour and a quarter east of Edmonton. And I took a look, and I found out, Fern's a fascinating guy. And he's Canada's leading cattle mutilation investigator. I think a lot of people think that the cattle mutilation phenomenon is restricted to the United States. It's not. There are a number of cases in Canada. Fern's investigated them, and he has his conclusions, his data. He's worked in the past with NIDS and other people in the United States, so it's sort of a cross-border thing, I guess. But for me, as a filmmaker, what you're always looking for, as well as the cold, hard data, as it were, and the theories, is there a human story here? And Fern's, I think he's in his late 70s, and he's a crusty old guy. Years, 40, 50 years as a top cattle farmer, award winner. You should see his wall. He's got banners and trophies. The guy knows his cattle. So that lends a veneer of credibility to him that perhaps most mutologists, or whatever you want to call them, don't have, because he spent his life around these animals. So when he talks, regardless of what you think about cattle mutilations, you sort of have to listen to him, because he's raised these animals his entire life. And he certainly has the respect of the people in his community up there in St. Paul and in the area around it. So cattle mutilations are interesting in and of themselves, but Fern provided a very human angle to the story that always intrigues any filmmaker, I think. And that's the film's as much about him as it is about the subject of cattle mutilations.
Well, I love his name. Did he ever have cattle mutilations on any of his farms?
No. Again, here's a guy who, it's a very interesting story. St. Paul built a UFO landing pad purely, and they admit it, as a tourist idea in 1967, which was Canada's centennial. So there was a lot of money flowing around to build things, and they built a UFO landing pad for no particular reason. They just thought it would be a good draw. As it turns out, it was. In the early 1990s, their Chamber of Commerce decided to add a building to the UFO landing pad shaped like a flying saucer that would serve as the town's Chamber of Commerce, and they thought a good stunt, and again, they make no bones about it, it was a publicity stunt, would be to set up a UFO hotline. But they would take the UFO calls seriously as they would come in. And amidst the UFO calls that were coming in, they started to get some calls about cattle mutilations. And Fern knew the general manager of the Chamber of Commerce at the time, Paul Peltier, who we interviewed for the film as well. They got a call one day, and Fern just happened to be walking into the office, and Peltier said, "Hey, we just got a call from Saskatchewan. There's a cattle mutilated there. They want us to go have a look at. Would you come?" And Fern said, "Sure, I'm not doing anything else. I'm retired. Why not?" And he went, and I think Paul Peltier is quoted in the film as going, "Wow." I think that's his exact quote. Yeah. Fern's a little more circumspect. He doesn't go, "Wow." He says, "Well, when I first got there, I thought maybe this is not real." But then he talks about the reasons why he believed that case was real, as a cattle mutilation and a paranormal anomalous event, and why he goes on to generally believe that there is an anomalous, perhaps paranormal aspect to cattle mutilations that can't be explained simply by, most people say predators. The proper way to put it, I think, would be scavengers, animals that come along and scavenge animals that are already dead. Because the term predators implies that maybe some small coyote pulled down a cattle, and that's not quite correct. The idea is that the cow dies and the scavengers wander in and inflict the wounds. So that's Fern. That's his story, and he's in the film. Kevin Randall's in the film, taking a very skeptical look at it. Kevin is one who believes that cattle mutilations, or is convinced rather, that cattle mutilations can be explained in prosaic terms, scavengers, by and large, with a few hoaxes thrown in.
Did you talk with Linda at all? Moulton Howe?
No, I didn't. Did talk to Nick Redfern. There are other people involved in the film. Didn't talk to Linda Moulton Howe, no.
And in terms of Ferns, and I know because this is a film, you don't want to give out the bottom of it, but is he convinced beyond just paranormal that, yes, there are some natural occurrences here, yes, there are some animals that are scavenging cattle, but that there's something else going on too?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, that's not a leap I would make, but as a filmmaker, it's not about the leaps that I would make, it's the leaps that the subject would make. And Fern is very cagey, and Greg Bishop's in the film, interviewed about cattle mutilations and the history of it, and Greg said something very interesting. He said, Fern, for a guy that you might write off as a simple country bumpkin farmer kind of guy, is a very cagey guy. He doesn't come right out and say what he thinks they are. He will tell you in his lectures, I don't think it's this, I don't think it's this, I don't think it's this. And if by the process of elimination you kind of go through it, it's pretty clear that he thinks it's probably aliens, or at least aliens are involved in some of them. But he won't say that. And Greg Bishop made the point that's in the film, and I think it's a very good point, that that's probably the best way to approach it if you are convinced that maybe it's aliens, or conversely, if you're convinced that maybe it's the government doing it, is to not come out and say that directly, but to sort of say that is probably the most likely way to do it. And that way you tend to not drive off people who might sort of say, well, you're just a UFO wingnut. And I think Fern's been pretty successful at that. I've seen him at his lectures, and people keep an open mind when he presents his evidence. And he does it pretty well, too. I think people will be captivated by him when they see the film and go, yeah, this guy, whether you believe or not in what he's telling you, this is a guy that walks the walk and not just talks the talk, rather, but he's walked the walk for many years. So let's listen to him.
How were some of the cattle mutilated, Paul? I mean, was it very difficult to determine?
Well, that depends on your point of view. If you sort of believe that they're scavengers, then there's relatively easy explanations for all of it. Fern, describes wounds with surgical precision and laser cuts and stuff, as Linda Moulton Howe does.
Which can't happen from an animal.
No, but other people, like Kevin Randall and like any one of a number of veterinarians, and the much-maligned Ken Rommel and his report, which drew upon a wide range of veterinary expertise, will tell you that those wounds can be made by animals. They're not done with surgical precision or lasers. They just look like they're done with surgical precision or lasers. But in fact, for instance, coyotes can make very fine cuts that can resemble things, at least to the untrained eye, taking a relatively quick look, maybe to surgical precision. Kevin Randall brings up a very interesting point. He says every police officer who ever says that this looked like it was cut by a laser, the first question you should ask them is, have you ever seen anything that was cut by a laser outside of a Star Wars film?
No.
Do you actually know what a laser burn looks like? Have you seen flesh cut by a laser before? If they have, then okay, fine. If they haven't, well, you take that observation for what it's worth, which might not be very much. So just because you're a police officer, for instance, doesn't make you an expert on veterinary medicine or an expert on lasers or anything like that. So there's a very interesting debate that goes on in the film, primarily between Kevin and, which is interesting because Kevin's no debunker. Kevin's one of the arch proponents of the Roswell crash and a noted ufologist who believes aliens have visited our planet. On the issue of cattle mutilations, though, he just doesn't believe that aliens have visited our planet to mutilate cattle. So it's a difficult, he's an interesting, in this case, I guess, debunker in this instance. And it's a very interesting dichotomy between him and Fern Belzil as the film winds its way along. And Nick Redfern and Greg Bishop and some other folks chiming in as it moves along.
All right, as promised now, let's go to the calls west of the Rockies. You're on Coast to Coast with Paul Kimball. Hi there.
Hi there. My name's John. Morning from another fellow Canadian. I'm a truck driver coming up from Oregon, Washington.
Sure. Hi, John.
The thing that really gets me, and I was wondering if you come up against a wall, is the religious aspect of the of all the UFO and thing. I mean, I'm a believer in UFOs and that, but you hear the backlash, and you hear the people say that well, that's impossible. We're the only chosen one, which I think is narrow-minded and naive. But do you ever get, how you get blocked off by the religious aspect? They think you're just, making this up. There's no such thing. It's never been, written or whatever. Because, I hear friends of mine who are, religious say, well, this can't be because, we're the only ones, blah, blah, blah. It just really annoys me that, they're so narrow-minded thinking that we're the only intelligent life in the entire universe.
There is a group, a subset within, in particular, say, Christianity, which is the predominant religion in North America, the evangelicals among the evangelicals, if you will, that some of them might believe that and act that way. Evangelicals I've talked to, however, and we have some in my family, so it does make for an interesting family reunion when Stan and I and some of the evangelical types get together. I find them very open-minded, actually. They ascribe a different explanation to it. Often you'll hear evangelicals say it's demons or something. But the important thing, again, is to note that they actually believe that the phenomenon exists, and then you're really discussing what you believe it is. But they don't necessarily deny that it exists. The funny thing is, I find that ufologists tend to run screaming whenever religion is mentioned. And sort of shut the doors and don't want to talk about it at all. There are exceptions. Barry Downing's book, The Bible and Flying Saucers, is a classic of ufological literature. I had the pleasure of meeting and interviewing Barry some years ago when I was doing the Stanton T. Friedman Israel book. But there is, I think there is a religious aspect to this, perhaps, that ufology should look at, and there might be some common synergies here. And that's another 3-hour show to talk about some of those. But here's just one. What if UFOs are time travelers, which is possible, theoretically possible? Guys like Michio Kaku tell us this might be possible. Well, one of the basic tenets of most religions, and certainly of Christianity, is that God is eternal. A Canadian evangelist named Henry Allen referred to it as the eternal now. He's, as the Beatles said, yesterday, today, and tomorrow, it's all the same thing to God. Well, what if 5,000 years from now we figure out how to travel through time, or we figure out that time really is a nonlinear concept? Well, at that point, do we not become God? Because that's one of the fundamental properties of what we see God as being. And, then that opens up a whole can of worms, and we come back and we create ourselves and stuff like that. And I think those are some of the things that ufology should at least be willing to consider and talk about, if for no other reason than it makes for interesting conversation over a beer at a conference. But I think it goes beyond that, and I think ufology shouldn't be, in their quest to seem scientific, shouldn't turn their back completely on religion any more than religion should turn their back on the possibility that there's life on other planets or other dimensions.
Okay, thank you. Let's go first-time caller line. You're up on Coast to Coast. Hi there.
Good
Hello.
evening. Good evening.
Go ahead, sir.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, hi.
Okay, great. Good evening, guys. It's Robert from Los Angeles. I've been studying UFO phenomena for quite a while now, and this is really not something new. We've known about UFOs. We've been documenting it for hundreds of years, maybe in thousands of years. We have information in the Bible, a wheel in the sky which is turning. Anything round that they saw, I think you think was a wheel, something in the sky round like a disc, and they said it's called it a wheel. We have a picture. Have you seen the drawing of the Madonna? It's hundreds of years old, and you see a man pointing in the air with his dog, and here is a spaceship with a dome on it. There's someone inside of it. It has radio antennas on it, and it's inside of a photo. A drawing that's hundreds of years old. So we've been documenting this for hundreds of years throughout our history, and we have documents, on the Bible, and we have artists and drawings and stuff, museums. And I was just wondering. Since the research I've been doing, I've met with people in Air Force and stuff. One-on-one, and when you do that, you don't really discuss what you talk about. But our military does know about this. There are flying objects, of course, but the biggest part of the mystery isn't really are they real, are they here. There's thousands and thousands of photographs that people have taken of these things, so there's no question about it that it is real. The main thing that I found out about it is that they have the ability these individuals who are flying these things have the ability to actually do things neurologically to people, to actually forget events that have taken place. For instance, a massive UFO sighting in California over the 101 freeway. On the 101 freeway, hundreds of cars saw a disc hovering above the freeway, and this was documented. But yet, after a few months after this happened, people forget about it. They forgot about it. I went on the street in the area where the UFO was seen, talked to people on the street, and they go, yeah, I remember that. But somehow their memory was erased, it seems, because they forgot about it. Do you know about the neurological part of the UFO phenomenon when people have seen UFOs, and then automatically a week or two later oh, yeah, that did happen. But why did it stay in their mind? And why, when a UFO occurrence happens, they investigate it 4 and 5 years after the fact rather than investigate it right after it happened? And this happens all the time in ufology. We have the lights in Arizona, Phoenix lights. It wasn't investigated immediately. It took years before people said, hey, that really happened. What's going on? There's some sort of neurological thing where people are actually have their minds messed with. And I was with some officers, and they're telling me, hey, they know that I'm a researcher, and they told me, hey, we've been seeing this light following us around. This seems to happen a lot with police officers. If you've done your research, you'll notice a lot of police officers out at night, and they see things, and they're excellent observers. And they told me, we see this light following us around. It's an orange glowing light. And I'm sort of laughing to myself, okay, an orange glowing light following you guys around. So I hung out with these guys. I'm not kidding you. I saw this thing, an orange glowing light. It looked like a balloon with a light in it. I couldn't make any sense out of it, what it was. I was with the guys, and we were gone. We were completely gone for 3 hours. We're totally gone. People trying to radio in, and we were totally gone for 3 hours. And I remember looking at this thing. I turn around, look at it, and then I drowse off, and my head turns away from it. I turn back, and it's closer. And they were doing something trying to keep us from looking at it. And every time we turned back, it was closer, then it was closer, then it was closer, and then we have 3 hours missing. And all of us were exhausted like we ran 100 miles. Okay? So they must have done some sort of, physical endurance thing or something on us, or whatever, but this phenomenon is pretty weird, being that close to it and being missing and people trying to contact you by radio, and you're not even there. And I'm sure you've heard these stories, haven't you?
Well, I got to tell you, you're a good researcher there, Bob. Paul, do you want to comment on any of the things you just said before we hit the break?
There's a lot of cases, of course, that purport to have missing time incidents. The Hill case is probably the most famous. I think there's an awful lot of cases. I don't think it's quite accurate to say that and I don't think the caller was saying it, that every case people tend to forget. There's actually a lot of cases where people have very vivid memories dozens of years later. But, to speculate, and here I'm only speculating, if they are extraterrestrial or extra-dimensional or advanced beyond us in any way, shape, or form, if they are, in fact, they, then it's probably reasonable to assume that they have technologies we wouldn't understand. And we're already starting to manipulate minds, and we have been for years trying to. And we just are at the very beginning of understanding how the mind works. So maybe if there are aliens out there, or extra-dimensionals, or time travelers, or whatever, they have a knowledge that we don't, and maybe they could possess those capabilities. So, yeah, sure, wouldn't rule it out, absolutely.
We'll come right back and take final phone calls with our guest Paul Kimball on Coast to Coast AM. Well, tomorrow's Wednesday already, and Michael Tazarian joins us. We're going to talk about the year 2012 and what all that means with Michael, and I'm looking forward to that. And by the way, just a reminder, Amazon.com is selling our book, Worker in the Light. It officially comes out September 19th, about the paranormal world, the unusual, and they are selling it at a substantial discount. If you want to jump on board with those pre-orders, it's at Amazon.com. The name of the book is called Worker in the Light. We'll be back in a moment. We'll wrap up with final phone calls with our guest Paul Kimball on Coast to Coast AM. Paul, where does the viewing public get a chance to see the two movies that are coming out, Fields of Fear and, of course, the UFO movie that we were talking about as well?
If you're in Canada, they'll be on Space, the Imagination Station, which is a major specialty channel, part of the Chum Group up in Canada. If you're in New Zealand, it's guaranteed you'll be able to see it on TV New Zealand, Best Evidence. If you're in the rest of the world, Our distributor's working hard on getting it into your neighborhood, but you could always help that process along. You could always feel free to call the Sci-Fi Channel or some other channel and say, Best Evidence, Fields of Fear. You might want to call this guy and get those films on because we'd like to see them. And that's the only commercial plug I'll make on the entire evening. But we hope to have those films, once they're completed, the distributor will work very hard at getting into as many markets as possible. And certainly I'd like to have them in the American market because, A, it's profitable, and B, there's an awful lot of people down here that seem to want to see films like that, and I'd like them to see them, of course.
Did you ever investigate that 1952 flap over the White House, Washington, D.C.? That case just really boggles my mind.
Funny you should mention that, George. Folks should tune in to Best Evidence, Top 10 UFO Cases.
Excellent.
And they may see something about the Washington flap. The interesting thing about the Washington case is there's more than just the sort of flap over Washington. There's, at the same general time, the Nash-Fortenberry case, which is an excellent UFO case. There's also a sighting by Paul Hill, who went on to become one of America's great scientists in the latter half of the 20th century. All of these things happening at the same time. So it's really there were a lot of bogus sightings then too, and it's tough with Washington to separate the wheat from the chaff. But the important thing to remember is for all the chaff that's there, there's some really good wheat that provides some wonderful ufological nourishment, as it were. So yeah, that's a very interesting case, and it's one of the classics of UFO history. Really, it was a defining kind of incident.
And I just brought it up. I have no idea what your top 10 UFO cases are.
There you go. It's psychic powers, really, yeah.
Or something like that.
Yeah.
Wildcard line, you're on the air with us. Hi there.
Yes, my name is Jeff. I'm calling you from outside of New York City. From
yes, Jeff, go ahead.
Mr. Norrie, it's a pleasure here listening to your program, and Mr. Kimball. Great work. We've got a few things in common. I'm a lawyer as well, and I'm also a filmmaker and a UFO researcher. So I have a case that you might find rather interesting. I think it addresses the issue you were bringing up about the possibility of time travel. And this came from my backyard down in Arkansas, and it was astounding. And it started me on the road to serious study. And it came about, I was looking through some documents on the Project Blue Book, and I ran across you mentioned earlier, the UFO airship flaps.
Mm-hmm.
And it turns out that I was reared in a small town in Arkansas, and our county seat, which today has a population of about 2,100 people, is called Harrisburg, Arkansas. And the oldest weekly newspaper in the United States is the Modern News. And that happened to be one of the landing places for the airship on April 21st, 1897. I'm going to tell you, what was said there, I don't think anybody could dispute. It was probably one of the best arguments for time travel that I've ever read. It's shocking, and I'd like to tell you a couple things about it. It's quite amazing.
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
All right. Well, first of all places, it lands, this thing at 1 o'clock in the morning, they call it the airship, and they don't even have a name for, the astronaut driver, what do you want to call it? They call it the manager. He's an elderly man. He's described. This thing, the whole article in the paper, the paper's kind enough to send me photographs of the original newspaper from 1897. And I was reading it, and I could not believe it because, for instance, it lands in the backyard of the founding father of the town, Senator Harris, who was a senator. He had just left office, I believe, and his family, the descendants still live there. And it lands about 1 a.m., and it's taking on water from the well, hence hydrogen propulsion that we read about a lot for future, automotive travel, you might say. But more interesting than that, he gets in a discussion. Out comes Senator Harris with his eyeglass, and before he can even get up to his eye, this thing in the distance is suddenly lowering down in his backyard. So he walks out, and off comes this. It's referred to as the elderly gentleman. He was described as having a black beard down to his waist and deep sunken black eyes. And there were 2 or 3 other folks with him that on the ship that were taking on water from the well. And so they start chatting, and he mentions that he'd just been to Dallas. So I did a little research. Turns out, sure enough, he said he'd been to Dallas. He left about 45 minutes earlier, just left from Dallas. Now, from Dallas to Harrisburg, it takes about 12 hours to drive. And they did it in 45 minutes because the Dallas paper had that same date. Earlier in the evening, he landed in the yard of a gentleman by the name of John Barkley. And Mr. Barkley pulled a Winchester out, and he was quickly told by the elderly gentleman not to fire. He just wanted to buy some things from the local blacksmith. And he asked him for some bluestone, a couple of coal chisels, and some machine oil. And so that confirmed it was amazing. It was the same ship. Here it is 45 minutes later. It's gone this distance of several hundred miles, and it lands. Well, they start chatting, and he starts talking. First of all, he says, well, I've overcome gravity, and how I do that, if you recall in the article that appeared 26 years ago in the St. Louis such-and-such newspaper, you'll remember reading about so-and-so gentleman, and that man was my uncle.
It had to be the Post-Dispatch, by the way.
I didn't know. I couldn't read exactly the name. They said it was formerly called the St. Louis Republican, I think, or something, or something. Now it's changed to the St. Louis something else. He tells
Maybe
you
then was the Globe Democrat.
I don't really know, sir. But what he says, there's a couple things in here that I just couldn't, you can't explain. I don't believe any other way. He mentions to the senator that he's overcome gravity by wrapping a wire around with this anti-gravity device he's got. He said it took him 19 years after he found, it took him the little device.
Well, is the guy human? Was he human?
Yes. Matter of fact, he was human, and he's described in such a way. It would take me another hour to tell you about a subsequent appearance of this man I have found appearing in New York in for lack of a better word, they've been called this Druid caves in upper New York State.
All right, and Paul, you want this story, Paul?
I've got to give you a couple facts here. You will not. I mean,
well, I tell you what. Let's give out your email address, if you would, Paul. We're going to run out of time here, but
sure.
If he's interested and he could send that to you, and you want to look at it, go ahead.
Absolutely, I'm always happy to look at anything. The email address is redstarfilm, REDSTARFILM @AOL.com. And if you go to my blog, which is currently posted on the Coast to Coast website, I guess, as a link, my email is right there on the blog, and it'll link directly take you to my email. And send it along, absolutely. I'm always happy to read any case or any story. Doesn't mean I'll accept it or believe it, but I'm always happy to look at it because there is more than just post-1947 cases, and there's more on heaven and earth than in all your philosophy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah.
What a bizarre story that was, huh?
Yeah, and it's interesting. He mentioned he'd looked into the Project Blue Book files, which brings up an interesting point that I'd just like to make very briefly, that everybody can be their own UFO researcher. You just don't have to take my word for it or Stan's or anybody else's. There's a wonderful website that if you go to my blog, it's on the sidebar links, the Project Blue Book Archives. Just click on that, and it'll take you to all. They don't have all the Project Blue Book files up yet, but they're working on it. And you can read through thousands of pages. You can type in searches and say, I'd like to look for this, and see the real Project Blue Book reports and get a really good feel for the history of the UFO phenomenon, particularly in the United States. It's a wonderful resource, and I'd encourage everybody to take a boo, as they say, down under, I guess.
First-time caller line, you're up on Coast to Coast. Hi there.
Yes.
Hello. Yeah, go ahead, sir.
Yeah. Yes, my name is Sean. I'm a truck driver. I want to say first, George Norrie, that I definitely enjoy your program. I definitely like the guests that you have on.
Thanks, Sean.
My question, or I guess the question and comment. First, I do definitely believe in those what they call flying saucers or whatever you want to call them. But in our faith, in my faith, we do believe in flying saucers, and we believe them to the point where we believe that wheel that Ezekiel talks about and Isaiah talks about in the Bible is actually God's coming. And I know that's kind of deep for someone to believe that God could actually be on the spaceship, but that's just our belief. But I was just reading in a book of one of my teachers, and it was talking about a mother plane and the evidence of that of a 1930s sighting that happened in Canada. And, you know, it so happened that I turned on George Norrie and to hear, you know, the guest to be a Canadian. So I was just wondering if he had any thoughts or anything that he's come across about any 1930s sightings that may have happened in Canada with a police officer.
Okay, and while you think about that, Paul, let me ask you also, Sean, very quickly, when you say your belief system, what religion are you?
Islam.
Islam, okay. Well,
Yes,
that's
sir.
interesting. Okay, that is interesting.
Yeah. Well, we believe God exists in us. We believe God is a man that he traveled through time just like we do. Just like a horse existed 1,000 years ago, exists today. And we believe that's how God exists. And we believe that God is a supreme being. So the quote-unquote life force that we may talk about as aliens, they're really not aliens. They're a highly intelligent form of us. Scientists say that we use 10% of our brain. Well, those particular aliens that we call that we don't know about are actually people who use more than 10% of their brain. And the Bible refers to them as angels. It refers to them as those who are sent on missions by God. So, you know, in that instance, we believe God exists in man. You know, he's just not some spirit we made after his form and image. But I, you know, have to really go there. But we believe that God exists somewhere in this atmosphere and that he is in hiding. And in the book that I was reading, it talks about a mother plane that is 1.5 miles by 1 mile long, something of what you saw on Independence Day.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this sighting that was stated in the book happened in Canada. And I just read this before I even turned on the show. It's, you know, not a coincidence. I believe everything happens for a reason. But it was a sighting in Canada by a police officer who say, and a couple other, as a matter of fact, it mentioned not only a police officer, but, you know, multiple people saw this ship that actually looked like a small city.
All right. Well, let's see, Paul, did you ever come across that? And I'll let you, Sean, listen on your radio to his response. Do you know of this case?
I don't, and if anybody has details, feel free to email me or Stan or any other Canadian researcher, Chris Rutkowski. I'm sure we'd be interested to hear about it. There is a case that I do know of quite well in 1996 in the Yukon of a mothership. Stan refers to it as a mothership case. Multiple witnesses at multiple locations watching this thing fly over the northern Yukon, and the northern Yukon's fairly north because the Yukon's in the north anyway. And that's one of the really good cases out there. So what your caller was describing, what Sean was describing, is something that I'm familiar with, but in a case that happened 60 years later. And that's interesting in and of itself. The commonality, as Dick Hall often points out, of certain types of cases. You know, you can group them in certain classifications. The religious angle, too, as we've talked about briefly before, George, is very interesting. You know, most chat groups or UFO forums out there have a religious form as well, and a spiritual form, and a parapsychology form. I belong to one that, again, you can access from my blog, a link on the side, UFO Planet. UFO/planet.net, and all of these groups out there, you know, they talk about extraterrestrials and extradimensionals, and they also talk about science, and they also talk about religion. And I think, you know, there's commonalities and there's interrelationships between all of those things that, you know, can't be ignored and are worth talking about. And it's always worth having that kind of discussion. So what Sean just said, I find very interesting. And the concept, as we said earlier, of the eternal now, of God as a time traveler, that's some deep stuff. But it's interesting stuff too, and it's fun to chat about and to look into. Absolutely.
Are you getting reports of these large triangular-shaped objects all over the place, which I think might be military?
Yeah, one of the most well-known triangle object cases is the Belgian sort of flap, if you will, in 1989-90. You know, I don't know what to make of the triangle cases, but there seem to be indications that they might be advanced military aircraft being tested. That's certainly what it seems like a lot of people think. But there are other people, and Nick Pope is one of them in the United Kingdom, that think very highly of the Belgian case and believes that it may, in fact, be something beyond just military aircraft. It might be paranormal. So, that's certainly, but it's certainly, again, as Dick Hall has pointed out in his UFO evidence, it's a type of case. There's a multitude of types of cases: cigar-shaped objects, motherships, cylindrical objects, the classic flying saucers, the triangles now. And when you start to see report after report after report, all of them describing the same characteristics, you have to sort of sit up and take notice and at least take it seriously. It's not just an isolated incident, and that's important.
Do you think that the American people and the Canadian public believes in extraterrestrial visitations?
I think there's a segment that believe in it. I think there's another segment that are convinced that it's probably happening. I think both are probably smaller than some ufologists like to think. What I think, though, is that there's a large segment of the population that is open to, if presented properly, hearing about UFOs in a serious manner. And I think there's a large segment of the population, including many scientists, who believe, or are convinced, whichever term you want to use, that there's probably life out there beyond our little mud ball floating around in our little solar system. And I think both of those things open up opportunities for ufology to expand beyond its rather limited confines at the moment and try and engage a broader population in a broader conversation. And I think that's imperative if you're going to move ufology forward. But are there masses of people, a majority of people out there that believe aliens are landing on Earth or visiting? I don't think so. But I think there's a majority of people who are open to the idea of extraterrestrial life and maybe even open to the idea of extraterrestrial visitors. Possibly.
Paul, good luck on all your films, and let's keep in touch, my friend, all right?
Thanks, George. It's been a real pleasure. You'd make a great maritimer. And that's a good thing.
All right. That's Paul Kimball. For Karis Coburn, Dan Galante, Steve Carr, Tom Danheiser, Lisa Lyon, Lex Lonehood, Sean Ladesseur, Ross Mitchell, Ian Punnett, and Art Bell, I'm George Norrie. Somewhere out there on Coast to Coast AM, I'll see you on our next edition. Until then, be safe.
To people, it works. It's working, and that I think it's a really a positive, optimistic sign for our future that we can reclaim the country effectively.
Do you believe there's going to be any activity, because your organization, 9/11 Truth, would like to get these politicians or candidates to really recognize, hey, this is a major issue here, let's get some answers. But is it going to go any further than where it is now, Mike?
Absolutely. I think this poll shows that the American people, I mean, again, those who are aware of, for example, the collapse of this third building, Building 7, happens to be almost the same proportion of people in the poll who don't trust the official story and want a new independent investigation. So I think the implications are that if you're a political candidate running in 2006, there's an enormous constituency here of people who are looking for change.
Mike, so important for you to tell us about your organization, because you are not conspiracy buffs. You are a coalition of some dedicated people. Tell me about the members of the 9/11 Truth organization.
Sure. I mean, we're a grassroots organization made up of average people, of, in some cases, researchers, journalists, artists, scholars, average people who put together and publish research on the Internet, put together events like our upcoming conference in Chicago, 9/11, Revealing the Truth, Reclaiming Our Future, and are involved in public education to raise awareness about the events of 9/11, but not only 9/11, because ultimately for us to be effective as in changing the direction our country is going, we have to find common ground with other people who also see that 9/11 has been the justification for so many unfavorable policies, illegal wars. Even just last week when they released the Flight 77 video at the Pentagon.
Right.
Over and over, you heard this as the justification that Americans needed to be reminded why we're in Iraq, why we're in this war, and why it's okay to have Americans under surveillance.
Mike, is your organization taking a stand on that issue itself, Flight 77, that some people say never hit the Pentagon? My question to those people, whether it did or did not, I do not know, though I'd like to see the video, quite frankly, because what I've seen so far doesn't show me a plane hitting the Pentagon at all, so I have some doubts. But I want to know what happened to the plane, where it might be. Does your organization look into that?
Actually, George, our position is very similar to yours in that we support the Freedom of Information Act requests, not just by Judicial Watch, but there was actually another person, Mr. Bingham, who had filed multiple Freedom of Information Act requests. His were never acknowledged. It's interesting that the government chose to honor the Freedom of Information Act request of Judicial Watch, and yet they really didn't, who we know were then subsequently, within 1 year after 9/11, promoted. We had one cell living with an FBI informant. They had driver's licenses, telephones in their names. Some of them were even registered to vote. They trained at military air bases. So when you begin to look at that, it becomes quite puzzling how it is that we were unaware on the one hand, especially in light of, whistleblower testimony like Robert Wright and Colleen Rowley, et cetera, saying, we knew this was coming. We tried to really prevent this, and we were prevented from doing our job.
Well, which backs up my argument, Mike, that there were members within government who knew what were going on. There were members in government who wanted this to happen for their own personal reasons, and they go ahead and cut the deal with the bin Laden group to get this done with al-Qaeda. I mean, there's no doubt in my mind that somebody flew those planes into those two towers. Somebody was trying to hijack and successfully hijacked, and whether the Flight 93 over Pennsylvania was shot down or pulled down, who knows? I happen to think it was shot down. But the point is that somebody had to do that, and somebody had to be convinced to go on a suicidal mission. Whether just the pilot knew about it and his friends did not, who knows? But to me, your argument points out that mine might be correct in that there were two groups working together to get this thing done.
Well, we can take that a little further. I mean, on the one hand, we know that Osama was an asset of the CIA. We backed him, financed him, armed him. And to take what you're saying a little further, there's another possibility that is a little bit easier to understand, which is maybe the people who were trained or co-opted for this event, for this attack, for these hijackings, they didn't even have to know they were suicide hijackings. I mean, in essence, they may have been under the impression that they were going to make political demands. I mean, there may be other alternatives here. It gets a bit murky. It really depends on where the research leads.
If we as a group can take the position that a group got together with bin Laden and put this together, maybe bin Laden was approached by it, but they put this together, I think we can get the answers quicker.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think the entire issue surrounding this is that, again, going back to the poll, it demonstrates that the people who are aware of the evidence want really an independent investigation, either by Congress or an international body. But I think really it has to be a truly independent investigation. It can't be run by the same people in Congress. And I think that also touches back where you were going on how split the country is. Because if many people only see this as a polarized left-right dichotomy or Republican-Democrat, that it's always filtered through that lens because they only gave us those more ambiguous frames, as you said, which still don't prove their case. So for us, I mean, on another level, I see the Flight 77 issue as a distraction because there are so many more salient and hard evidence of potential complicity, such as, the collapse of Building 7 in New York, a third building not hit by a plane, collapsed at 5:20, and the media shows the towers coming down, the planes hitting the towers. But why won't they ever show this third building? I mean, which in any other state, such as, Missouri, it'd be the tallest building in the state.
Oh,
47-story building came down in 6.6 seconds in its own footprint, which is what's so odd about it. If you begin to look at how this building was built, it didn't have a support structure like in normal high-rise buildings that was symmetrical because it stood over an electrical substation in Lower Manhattan. So for it to come straight down is quite odd. And then even eyewitnesses, such as New York Magazine reporter Mark Jacobson said, I was down at Ground Zero. I was there. I saw the building come down, and a firefighter, came up to me and he said, that building's going to come down. Well, that's kind of strange because no steel frame structure has ever collapsed from fire alone. And
I've been wrestling with something, Mike, for a number of years now, and I'm almost at a point now where I'm pretty secure in what I think might have happened. And I'm going to say this for really the first time. I hinted about it when I had a roundtable discussion on 9/11 several months ago. I have been wrestling with the question of why is this so polarized? Why will we have slightly more than 50% of the people not believing the government's version and then the rest of the people believing everything that they've been told? To a point where there's no middle ground here. I am beginning to believe that both people are correct. And what I think might have happened here is there's no doubt in my mind that the Osama bin Laden's and his group of cronies were part of this, and that he was smart enough to convince 19 people to commit suicide on these missions. However, and this is where I think the conspiracy people are accurate as well, I think there was another group involved that somehow got bin Laden involved, financed him, helped him in order to justify whatever's going on, whatever they're profiting on. And they got together as a conspiratorial group together and did what they did. So I think the two facets, the two factions are correct. They just haven't put it together yet. I think that's what happened. What's your take?
I mean, it's quite possible, but once you start to dig into the details, it really becomes quite murky because, for example, we now know that the hijackers were under continuous surveillance, and I don't use that word loosely. I mean continuous surveillance by both domestic and foreign intelligence agencies. You had Able Danger. You had FBI agents who, sent their reports to headquarters, and those investigations were thwarted by the same few people.
From the heartland of America, the gateway to the West. Good morning, good evening, wherever you may be, across the nation, around the world. I'm George Norrie, and welcome to the world's most listened to Coast AM. Good to be with you, and thanks for the privilege of broadcasting this wonderful program for you. Open lines at the half, and next hour, Paul Kimball, UFO cases in North America. And get ready for some of the things he's going to say. Well, here's some quick stories of the day. Even though this tape, purporting to be from Osama bin Laden, has not been authenticated yet, he is saying that Zacarias Moussari had no link to the 9/11-2001 attacks. Now, this, according to the al-Qaeda leader, again, but like I said, this audio tape that surfaced on a website has not been authenticated. Who knows who it may be? It could be bin Laden. Bin Laden's alleged voice claims responsibilities to carry out the attacks, that they were given by him to 19 men, and that Moussari was not one of them. The new tape is propaganda, plain and simple, says a U.S. intelligence source. The official said the message is part of bin Laden's continuing effort to demonstrate that he's a relevant extremist leader who is knowledgeable of current events. The tape is not entirely unexpected. Leading up to the Moussari verdict, the government was monitoring jihadist websites in anticipation of a response to the jury's decision. A new Zogby poll apparently reveals that less than half of the American public trusts the official 9/11 story or believes the attacks were adequately investigated. The poll is the first scientific survey of Americans' belief in a 9/11 cover-up or the need to investigate possible U.S. government complicity. In a moment, we're going to be talking with some people about this from the 9/11 Truth Organization. That's a coalition of researchers, journalists, and victim family members working to expose and get answers to this situation. So that story is upcoming in just a moment. Now, don't panic on this one, because we are still going to hold our own here in our views that the bird flu will not become a pandemic. But according to the World Health Organization, they say a family of 8 people infected with the bird flu in Indonesia may have passed the disease among themselves rather than catching it from poultry. The agency did not immediately indicate whether it was going to raise its alert level, which remained at 3, where it's been for months. That means there is no very limited human-to-human transmission. They don't seem to be too concerned about that, but I wanted you to know about that story anyway. Another attack by an animal on a human. This in Orwell, Ohio. A 500-pound bear escaped from an animal breeder, entered a neighboring home, and attacked a woman. The victim was expected to survive. The bear was lured out of the house and shot to death by the breeder. But still, again, another attack by animals. The Egyptian authorities have given the go-ahead for the underwater exploration of what appears to be a Roman city submerged in the Mediterranean. Well, the old guy that we talk about all the time, Zahi Hawass, said in a statement that an excavation team that had found the ruins of the Roman city some 20 miles east of the Suez Canal on Egypt's north coast. The archaeologists had found buildings, bathrooms, ruins of a Roman fortress, ancient coins, bronze vases, and pieces of pottery that all date back to the Roman era. Egypt's Roman era, by the way, lasted from 30 B.C. to 337 A.D. In Bucharest, Romania, more than 60 years after it was seized by communists, the Romanian government is to hand back one of the country's most popular tourist sites, the fabled Dracula Castle, to its former owner. The handover ceremony will take place Friday in the 14th Century Castles Museum, deep within the fortress in Transylvania. The castle, worth an estimated $25 million, was once owned by the late Queen Marie and bequeathed to her daughter, Princess Elena, in 1938. It was confiscated by the communists in 1948 and fell into disrepair. Now, in a moment, as I mentioned, we are going to be talking with a member of the 9/11 Truth Organization about this quest here. Apparently, Americans would like to get more information. They want to get to the bottom of 9/11. We'll be back in a moment on that story on Coast to Coast AM. Mike Berger is the media coordinator for the 9/11 Truth Organization. Born and raised in New York, he earned a degree in sociology with a focus on human motivation. The 9/11 Truth Organization, as I mentioned, is a coalition of researchers, journalists, and family members working to expose and get answers to the hundreds of still unresolved questions concerning 9/11. Mike works to get to the truth of what went wrong and why we were so unprepared for the attacks. He's currently married, lives in St. Louis, my neck of the woods. Mike, I'm still in St. Louis. We should have invited you down to the cave for this interview. How are you?
Great. How are you, George?
Good. It's good to talk with you. This Zogby poll, which is estimating now that over 70 million American adults support a new 9/11 investigation, tells me that there's still a lot of unrest. After all these years, they cannot muster, those people who believe the true government position cannot even muster 50% of the people to believe the story. What does this tell you, Mike, in the organization 9/11 Truth?
Well, I think it's quite amazing, actually, if you think about the powerful machinery of the mainstream media, or as some people call them, the liberal media, in promoting the official propaganda of the government conspiracy story. If they can't muster, after 4.5 years, more than half the country supporting the official story, it would seem to me that it demonstrates that grassroots movements in this country are and can be effective. That we no longer rely on just the mainstream media for information, of the power of the internet and new technology to communicate and get research and evaluate evidence out